Where's my safe? It was in the bathroom, and now it's gone. I need to call the police. Wait, hold on. My husband quickly calmed me down. Relax, I took the safe. What? Why? That was my savings. What did you do with my $300,000? He just shook his head. Your money is my money. I bought a house, for me and my mom. Are you serious? I was going to tell you, but since you found out, I'm telling you now. Divorce me? Go ahead. I already have your money, so I don't need you anymore. I was too shocked to argue. Fine, enjoy your new life with your mom. Wow, you're taking this well. Bye. He left, looking happy. Strangely, I felt relieved. The money in that safe wasn't just for savings. I had planned to ruin his life with it anyway. He just saved me the trouble. Good luck with that. Nice life, Michael. My name is Sandra. I'm 35, a housewife. I lived with my husband, Michael, and our daughter, Lydia, in the suburbs. Michael and I met 10 years ago through a coworker. He was polite, calm, and seemed like a great guy. We started as friends, then dated, and after 5 years, we talked about marriage. We both wanted kids, so it made sense. We got married, and a year later, we had Lydia. Watching her grow was amazing. Her first steps, her first words, then preschool. Life was mostly good, though, of course, there were ups and downs. But one thing really annoyed me. Michael's mom, Anita. She lived nearby, alone after her husband passed away. She was heartbroken at first, but over time, she started going out again, smiling more. I was happy for her. But then, she started overstepping. She had a spare key to our house and would let herself in while we were out. She cooked, rearranged furniture, even gave advice on when to have another baby or buy a house. Hi, Sandra, I made dinner and did the laundry. Oh, thanks, Anita, but you don't have to. We can manage. Oh, it's no trouble. We're family. I could even redecorate your bedroom. I knew she meant well, but it was overwhelming. I didn't want to offend her, but it felt like she didn't respect our space. My friends didn't see a problem, which made me feel like I was overreacting. I talked to Michael, but it was useless. She's just helping. Why complain? It's less work for you. I just wish she'd ask first. So, what? You want me to tell her she's not welcome? That she shouldn't come over? Every time I brought it up, he got defensive. He was usually calm, except when it came to his mom. I understood that he wanted to protect her, especially after losing his dad, but I still felt uncomfortable. One weekend, I woke up at 9 a.m. and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As I poured the water, I realized I had left my phone in the bedroom. I went back to get it. Michael and Lydia were still asleep, so I opened the door quietly. As expected, they were out cold. I tiptoed to the bedside table to grab my phone. That's when I noticed something strange. The walk-in closet door was slightly open. That's weird. I was sure it was closed last night. Did Michael open it? I walked over to shut it, but something felt off. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I pulled the door open wider. No way. My safe was gone. I completely forgot about being quiet and screamed. What do I do? Who could have seen this coming? Panic hit me, and for a moment, I couldn't think straight. Then, I snapped out of it. I need to call the police. I was about to dial when Michael groaned and finally woke up. Ugh, what's with all the noise? You're gonna wake Lydia. Michael, my safe is gone. I'm calling the police. I looked at my phone, ready to call, but Michael quickly stopped me. Wait, don't be so dramatic. Dramatic? My safe disappeared. This is serious. Michael hesitated. I glared at him. Do you have something to say? If not, I'm calling. Silence. Then, finally, he spoke. I took it, and your cash card too. I froze, my body locked up in shock. When I finally snapped out of it, I checked my wallet. My cash card was gone. I turned to Michael. He looked relieved, like he had no worries at all. That made me even angrier. Why did you take it without asking? That was my savings. What the hell did you spend $300,000 on? Michael shook his head like I was the one being unreasonable. Your money is my money. I bought a house, found a good-sized place in the countryside for $300K. What? The countryside? What about your job? My job? And Lydia, she'll have to change schools. I was yelling now, but I didn't care. Michael frowned, irritated, then he hit me with something even worse. I bought the house for my mom and me, just the two of us. Since you're always complaining about her, I'm done letting you disrespect her. I snapped. Do you even hear yourself, you idiot? Michael scowled. I don't need a broke wife. I'll take custody of Lydia, just sign the divorce papers, okay? I was so shocked by Michael's smug attitude that I couldn't even argue anymore. Then Lydia, startled by all the shouting, woke up. I picked her up from the bed. Michael had chosen his mother over his own daughter. There was no point in arguing anymore. Fine, let's get a divorce. Have a nice life with your mother. Michael grinned. Great, you're being reasonable. Wait here, I'll get the papers. To my surprise, he already had them prepared. He left the bedroom and came back quickly, shoving the papers in my face. His signature was already there. You can submit them. I'm going back to my mom's. He started packing. I watched him for a while, but all I saw was a stranger. He wasn't the man I once loved. Mommy, I'm hungry. Lydia had no idea what was happening. Her innocent voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Let's go have breakfast, sweetie. I walked out of the bedroom, holding her close. A few days later, Lydia and I were home together. I had taken some time off work. Since I was going through a divorce, I needed to sort out legal matters with my company. When I told my boss a little about my situation, he was understanding and let me take some paid leave. I really appreciated it. I explained the divorce to Lydia. She didn't fully understand, but I tried my best. Daddy likes Granny more than me? She asked. Then, she stopped talking about him. That broke my heart. I had to protect her. I would never let her feel abandoned. Mommy, your phone is ringing. I had been so lost in thought that I didn't even hear it. Thanks, honey, go play while I take this call. I picked up my phone. It was Michael. I had expected him to call sooner or later. Yes? The moment I answered, he exploded. What the hell? What's in that safe? Explain, now. His voice was a mix of yelling and crying. I smirked. As you can hear, it's proof that you and your mother stole my money. I know everything. She talked you into it, right? But you're still responsible for going along with it. Anita was the mastermind. Michael was just her pawn. I had known for a while that she had her eye on my safe. One day, when she thought I wasn't home, she let herself in. I watched as she walked straight to the bedroom. That made me suspicious. I followed quietly and saw her disappear into the walk-in closet. A few moments later, she left in a hurry. When I checked, I found scratches on the safe, like someone had tried to open it. 2 days later, my safe disappeared. I remembered everything when Michael and I fought. Michael's voice trembled. But, when did you record this? You weren't even there when we talked. I chuckled. Oh, you really didn't know? I was right there. That's why there's a recording. The day after Michael gave me the divorce papers, I went to Anita's house. I knew I couldn't stop the divorce or get my money back, but I wasn't going to let her get away with it so easily. Since I had a spare key, I decided to let myself in and scare her a little. It was nothing compared to what she had done, but it would make me feel better. The moment I stepped inside, I heard her and Michael talking. They were bragging about their new house. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and hit record. Then Anita started laughing, so proud of herself for stealing my money. That was when I realized she had planned everything. I was so furious I almost stormed in, but instead, I stayed quiet and kept recording. When their conversation ended, I went home, saved the recording onto a USB, and then I went back to Anita's house. You see, Michael, I left the USB in the safe. Are you choking yet? Silence. Michael was too stunned to respond. Then, I heard another voice take over. What do you even want from this? The money is already spent, so there's no point. Stop blackmailing us. Anita was hysterical. She wasn't wrong, the money was gone. When I checked the safe, only a few $100s remained. I smirked. You're mistaken. There is a point. You bought the house through an agency where Michael's friend works, right? Well, guess what? That agent is actually my friend, too. I knew him before I even introduced him to Michael. Now, what do you think would happen if he heard this recording? Maybe he'd report it to the police. Maybe he'd cancel the purchase and return the money. If that happens, you'll have to pay a hefty breach of contract penalty and cancellation fees. The truth? The agent was my friend, but the rest was a bluff. Still, the effect on Anita was immediate. Her voice trembled. No way. This is your fault for hoarding money. I spent it for you. What are we supposed to do if we can't live in our new house? You better fix this. She was spiraling, spitting out incoherent threats. I sighed. Not my problem. Do what you want. I pushed her nonsense aside and hung up, ignoring her desperate screams. For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. After that call, I reached out to my friend at the real estate agency. When I explained the situation, he was outraged on my behalf and, miraculously, managed to return my money. I had held on to a small hope, but I hadn't really expected it. Consider it a favor for an old friend, he said, then added, besides, I can't stand cheaters. Either way, I was elated. As for Michael and Anita? Turns out, the house they purchased was non-cancelable. However long it takes, I'll make sure they repay every cent, my friend assured me. They ended up working like slaves to pay off the loan. To make things worse, Michael had already quit his job to move to the countryside. There was no work that paid as well as his old position, so he was forced to take multiple exhausting jobs just to scrape by. Karma. With my money back, I bought a brand new apartment and moved in with Lydia and my parents. They offered to support me in the absence of a husband. As I stroked Lydia's hair while she slept with her head on my lap, I made a silent vow. I would do whatever it took to raise her to be an honest, kind person. Not like Michael. Not like Anita. She deserved a full, happy life, one I would give her, no matter what.
The crystal chandelier glittered above the white tablecloth as waiters in crisp black uniforms circled with silver trays of appetizers. Richardson's was Boston's most exclusive restaurant, the kind of place where reservations were hereditary and the menu didn't list prices. I adjusted my tie nervously, feeling like an imposter despite my carefully tailored suit. Across from me, Sophie smiled encouragingly, reaching under the table to squeeze my hand. We'd been dating for 2 years, but this was my first formal introduction to her extended family. Her father, Gregory Davidson, sat at the head of the table, occasionally checking his Patek Philippe watch as if our dinner was cutting into more important engagements. So Michael, he began after the sommelier had poured an expensive Bordeaux for everyone except my parents, who had requested water. Sophia tells me you're a teacher? He pronounced the word as if describing an exotic disease. Yes, sir. High school physics at Westridge Academy. Admirable. He nodded, not looking admirable at all. Starting salary for teachers these days is what, 40,000? 47 actually, I corrected politely, plus summers for research. Gregory exchanged glances with his brother Charles, a hedge fund manager whose Ferrari was probably being valeted outside. Research. I see. My parents sat quietly across the table. Dad in his dependable navy suit that he wore to church and special occasions, Mom in a simple dress she'd bought on sale at Macy's. They looked uncomfortable but dignified, determined to make a good impression despite the obvious wealth disparity. And your family business is? Gregory turned to my father, eyebrows raised. Robert owns a hardware store, my mother answered proudly. Callahan's Hardware in Worcester. It's been in the family for 3 generations. Charles nearly choked on his wine. A hardware store. Quaint. Very entrepreneurial, added Gregory's wife Victoria, her diamond earrings catching the light as she tilted her head condescendingly. I felt heat rising in my face, but Sophia jumped in. Michael's father gives incredible advice. He helped us fix up our apartment last summer. I'm sure he did. Gregory nodded, signaling for more wine. Though I imagine you'll be moving somewhere more suitable once you're married. Perhaps that high-rise development near the financial district? I know the developer. We're happy where we are, Sophia replied firmly. We'd had this conversation before. Her parents couldn't understand why their Stanford-educated daughter chose to live in a modest apartment on a teacher's salary when she could easily join her father's investment firm. So, Mr. Callahan, Charles leaned forward, swirling his wine. Do you find that people still shop at local hardware stores? With the big box retailers everywhere these days. My father smiled mildly. We do all right. Our customers appreciate personal service and expertise. I'll bet they do, Gregory chuckled. Though I can't imagine the margins are anything to write home about. Victoria touched her pearl necklace delicately. Do you handle the accounting yourself, or? My wife manages the books, Dad replied, nodding toward Mom. Sarah has always had a head for numbers. How resourceful, Victoria smiled thinly, keeping it all in the family. As the appetizers arrived, Sophia's cousin Bradley, fresh from his MBA at Wharton, decided to join in. A teacher's salary in Boston. How do you even survive? The table erupted in laughter, and I felt Sophia's hand tighten around mine under the tablecloth. My parents exchanged a glance but said nothing. We managed just fine, I said evenly. Oh, I'm sure you manage, Gregory chuckled, making air quotes. But marriage is expensive, and children even more so. Sophia was raised with certain standards. Dad, Sophia warned, but Gregory waved her off. It's a legitimate concern, princess. Michael seems like a wonderful young man, but practical matters matter. The Davidsons have certain financial expectations. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I would have ignored it, but the screen showed my father's office number, strange for a Friday evening. I'm sorry, I should take this. It might be important. I excused myself and stepped away from the table. Michael? It's Dad. Everything okay? Yes, but I need to speak with you and Mr. Davidson. Something's come up with his loan application. I frowned, confused. His what? His loan application. To the foundation. Could you put me on speaker when you get back to the table? Sure, Dad. When I returned, the conversation had moved on to Bradley's new position at Goldman Sachs. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry to interrupt, but my father needs to speak with Mr. Davidson. About a loan application. Gregory's fork clattered against his plate. What loan application? He asked me to put him on speaker, I said, still confused. I set my phone in the center of the table and pressed the speaker button. Mr. Davidson, Robert Callahan here. I apologize for interrupting your dinner. Gregory straightened his tie, composing himself. Callahan, what's this about a loan application? There must be some mistake. No mistake, sir. I'm calling about Davidson Development's application to the Callahan Foundation for the Downtown Revitalization Project. $50 million, if I recall correctly. The table went silent. Charles froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. What? Gregory stammered, color draining from his face. The board just approved it unanimously. I wanted to let you know right away since you marked it urgent. Shall I have the funds transferred Monday morning, or would you prefer immediate processing? There'd be a small expediting fee, of course. Gregory stared at the phone, then at my father across the table, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. You're Robert Callahan, of the Callahan Foundation. My father nodded simply. Yes, though I prefer Bob in social settings. Victoria's hand flew to her pearls. The Callahan Foundation that funded the new wing at Mass General? That owns half the waterfront. 30% of the waterfront, my mother corrected gently. We've diversified in recent years. I sat frozen, as confused as everyone else at the table. The Callahan Foundation. My parents had never mentioned any foundation. Mr. Davidson. My father's voice continued from the speaker. About that transfer. Gregory swallowed hard. Monday is fine, Mr. Callahan. Thank you. Excellent. We can discuss details at the board reception next week. Sarah and I look forward to seeing you there. Enjoy your dinner. The call ended, leaving an awkward silence broken only by the ambient restaurant noise around us. Charles was the first to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. Well, Robert, you've been holding out on us. My father took a sip of water. Not at all. You simply never asked about the foundation. We like to keep the hardware store as our public face. Keeps us grounded. The hardware store is a cover? Bradley asked incredulously. Not a cover, my mother clarified. It's where Robert's grandfather started. We maintain it out of respect for our roots and because we believe in honest work. The foundation grew from those principles. I stared at my parents, strangers suddenly in familiar faces. Why did you ever tell me? Mom reached across to touch my hand. We wanted you to find your own way without the burden of the family name. You chose teaching because you love it, not because you were rebelling against or conforming to family expectations. Gregory had gone from pale to flushed. The Callahan Foundation assets are, what exactly? Last quarter. Just under $12 billion, my mother replied matter-of-factly. We've had a good year. Victoria nearly dropped her fork. Billion? With a B? Philanthropy has been very good to us, Dad said mildly. Though we find that how you give matters more than how much. Gregory turned to me, his expression completely transformed. Michael, I had no idea. Please accept my apologies for any misunderstanding earlier. No apology necessary, I replied automatically, still processing this revelation. Sophia was staring at me, her expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if she was shocked, amused, or angry that I'd never shared this information I myself hadn't known. If you'll excuse us, she said suddenly, standing and taking my hand. Michael and I need a moment. She led me to a quiet alcove near the restaurant's entrance, away from prying eyes and ears. Did you know? She demanded immediately. Sophia, I swear I had no idea. The hardware store, our house in Worcester, everything has always been solidly middle class. Comfortable but modest. She searched my face, then burst out laughing. Oh my God, your father is incredible. Did you see Dad's face? I thought he was going to swallow his tongue. Her reaction broke the tension, and I found myself laughing too. I'm still in shock. $12 billion? My allowance growing up was $20 a week, and I had to mow the lawn for that. She grew serious, taking both my hands in hers. Why do you think they kept it from you? I thought about it, remembering countless childhood lessons about the value of hard work, the importance of earning respect rather than buying it, the responsibility that came with privilege. I think they wanted me to understand the value of things that money can't buy, to know who I was apart from wealth or status. And who are you, Michael Callahan? Sophia asked softly. The same person I was 20 minutes ago. A physics teacher who loves explaining how the universe works. The guy who fell in love with a brilliant woman who chose a meaningful career over a corner office in her father's company. I hesitated. Does this change anything for you? She shook her head firmly. Not a thing. Though I admit I'm enjoying watching my family squirm after the way they treated your parents. When we returned to the table, the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Gregory was engaged in animated conversation with my father about community development initiatives. Victoria was showing my mother pictures of her charity committee's recent gala, while Charles and Bradley listened attentively to every word my parents spoke. As we took our seats, Gregory raised his glass. A toast to Michael and Sophia, and to new family connections that promised to be enlightening. The evening continued with newfound warmth, though I noticed my parents remained exactly as they had been, polite, unpretentious, and quietly dignified. They answered questions about the Foundation's work without boasting, deflected inquiries about their personal wealth, and consistently steered conversations toward community impact rather than financial returns. After dessert, as we waited for the valet to bring around our cars, my father pulled me aside. Son, I owe you an explanation. You think, I replied, but without anger. He smiled apologetically. Your grandfather built something remarkable from that little hardware store, not just a business, but a philosophy about wealth and responsibility. When he established the foundation, he was clear about its purpose, to do good quietly, without seeking recognition or power. So you let me believe we were just ordinary? There's no such thing as just ordinary, Michael. Every person has value independent of their bank account. We wanted you to know your own worth before you knew your inheritance. And when were you planning to tell me? After the wedding, actually. We have a whole presentation prepared, he chuckled. Though I admit, I accelerated the timeline a bit tonight. I couldn't sit there and watch that man dismiss you and your mother. I shook my head, amazed. All these years, I've been applying for scholarships, working summer jobs, budgeting carefully. And those experiences shaped you into someone who understands the value of education, hard work, and financial responsibility. Would you trade that understanding for a childhood of privilege? Before I could answer, the Davidson family approached, led by Gregory with an entirely new demeanor. Robert, Sarah, we'd love to have you over to the house soon. Perhaps next weekend. A small gathering, just family. That sounds lovely, my mother replied graciously. Though we'd be equally happy to host you at our home in Worcester. It's modest, but the garden is beautiful this time of year. Victoria, who had probably never set foot in a suburb like Worcester in her life, nodded enthusiastically. We'd be delighted. Wouldn't we, Gregory? As we said our goodbyes, Sophia squeezed my hand and whispered, Your parents are amazing. They really are, I agreed, watching as they climbed into their 10-year-old Volvo. A car they clearly could have replaced with a fleet of luxury vehicles at any time. On the drive home, I called my parents on speakerphone so Sophia could hear. So, $12 billion? I asked without preamble. My mother laughed. 11.8 technically, and most of it is in the foundation, committed to various causes. But still, I was still struggling to reconcile this new reality with my understanding of my family. Michael, my father said gently, nothing important has changed. We're still the same people with the same values. The only difference is that now you understand the responsibility that will eventually be yours. The hardware store is a profitable small business that employs 15 people and serves a community that would otherwise have to drive 20 minutes to a big box store. It matters, son. Sophia leaned toward the phone. Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, I just want to say, thank you for raising someone who chose to teach because he loves it, not because he had to. We're the ones who should be thanking you, Sophia, my mother replied warmly, for loving our son when all you knew was that he was a teacher from a family that owned a hardware store. After we hung up, Sophia and I drove in contemplative silence for a while. Does it bother you? I finally asked. That I never knew. That I can't even claim I was rejecting wealth on principle. I just had no idea it existed. She considered this. What bothers me is thinking about how differently my family would have treated you if they'd known from the beginning. How differently they might have treated someone else in your position who didn't happen to have a secret fortune. Me too, I admitted. So what now? Do you quit teaching and join the family foundation? I shook my head firmly. Absolutely not. I love my job. Though I might talk to my parents about establishing a scholarship fund for students interested in STEM education. She smiled. That sounds perfect. Later that night, after dropping Sophia at her apartment, I drove to my own modest one-bedroom, seeing it through new eyes. I could move tomorrow to a penthouse, buy a sports car, live a completely different life. The possibility was dizzying. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and called my parents again. I need to understand everything, I told them. The foundation, the responsibilities, the expectations. If I'm going to be part of this legacy, I want to do it right. My father's voice was warm with pride. That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. Come home this weekend, we'll start at the beginning. And Sophia. Bring her, my mother said without hesitation. She's family now. As I hung up, I realized that while my understanding of my family had been appended, the core truths remained unchanged. My parents had always valued character over wealth, service over status, and genuine connections over social climbing. The revelation of our financial situation didn't change who we were. It just added responsibility to the values they'd already instilled. 3 months later, Sophia and I were married in a ceremony that balanced elegance with meaning. The Davidson family, still slightly shell-shocked by the revelation of the Callahan fortune, had become noticeably more humble. Gregory had even started showing genuine interest in community development beyond its profit potential. At the reception, my father clinked his glass for the traditional toast. Guests fell silent, many of them still adjusting to the idea that unassuming Robert Callahan from a hardware store was actually Robert Callahan of the Callahan Foundation. When Sarah and I decided to keep our foundation work separate from our family life, he began, we did so believing that wealth should be a tool for good, not a measure of worth. We wanted Michael to define himself by his character, not his inheritance. He turned to me and Sophia. Today, as we celebrate your marriage, we couldn't be prouder of the choice you made, to find someone who values you for exactly who you are, not what you have. He raised his glass. May you build a life together that remains true to itself, regardless of circumstance. And may you always remember that the greatest fortune isn't measured in dollars, but in how many lives you touch for the better. As glasses raised around the room, I caught Gregory Davidson's eye. The arrogance that had so defined him at our first dinner had given way to something resembling respect, not for the Callahan wealth, but perhaps finally for the Callahan values. And that, I realized, was the point of my parents' long deception, to ensure that when the truth eventually emerged, we would all understand that true worth had nothing to do with net worth at all.
My name is Eliana. I was born later in life to parents who had settled comfortably into their routines, already parenting a 9-year-old daughter they believed completed their family. We didn't plan for you, my mother would say, not with harshness but with the casualness of commenting on the day's weather. She often hinted that had it not been for my grandparents' encouragement, I might not have been born. It was evident that while my birth brought immense joy to my grandparents, for my parents, I was a responsibility they had not originally sought. My sister, Hannah, was a teenager absorbed in her world, filled with the typical pursuits of adolescence. She wasn't unkind. She simply lived as if I were invisible. While I entertained myself with toys in our living room's corner, she would lounge on the sofa, phone in hand, planning her future. "Hannah, honey, don't forget your SAT prep books," our mother would remind her, meticulously packing her backpack, while I sat at the kitchen table, silently wishing someone would notice I needed help with my homework. However, help rarely came from my parents. Instead, they fell into a routine that would define my childhood. Every morning, they would leave me at my grandparents' doorstep with a brief exchange. "You wanted her. She's all yours," my father would say to my grandfather, his keys jingling as he turned to leave for work. My grandparents' house became my true sanctuary. They nurtured me, supported my education, and filled my days with love and care, creating a stark contrast to the aloofness of my parents' home. "Eliana," my grandmother would say, her hugs enveloping me each night, "you're the best thing that ever happened to us." In those moments, nestled in her loving embrace, I could nearly forget the indifference that awaited me elsewhere. As the years passed and Hannah left for college, I hoped for a change in my relationship with my parents. Yet, the reality was far different. The responsibilities that once belonged to Hannah now fell on me. "Eliana," my mother would call out as soon as I walked through the door from school, "the house needs cleaning. Start with the bathrooms." Chores and more responsibilities piled up, and I learned to navigate them all, from laundry to cooking, all the while longing for the recognition that seemed perpetually out of reach. Despite the challenges at home, my grandparents' unwavering affection taught me invaluable lessons about love and self-worth. One day, my grandfather would assure me while we tackled my math homework, "You'll understand that sometimes the best things in life aren't planned." He'd wink, and for a moment, the burden of feeling unwanted would lift from my shoulders. Through their constant love and support, I learned what it meant to be truly valued, a stark contrast to the sense of being an afterthought in my own family. This dichotomy of experiences shaped my understanding of family, love, and self-worth, guiding me as I grew into someone who could appreciate the unplanned joys of life, just as my grandparents had hoped. I made spaghetti one evening. It was a bit overcooked but still decent enough to eat. My parents dined in silence, barely acknowledging the meal until my father finally spoke. "Tomorrow, try making something with chicken," he directed, his voice leaving no room for argument. It felt more like an order than a suggestion. For me, college was my beacon of hope. Each night, after I'd cleaned up from dinner, I'd escape to my room to explore university websites, dreaming about campuses far removed from the relentless household chores and the oppressive quiet of home. Then everything shifted when I was 14. Hannah burst through the door one Sunday, excitement radiating from her as she introduced Matthew, a smartly dressed man who is now her fiancé. "Mom, Dad, this is Matthew. We're engaged." It was as if she had announced a major lottery win. My parents leaped up, overwhelmed with excitement. My mother burst into tears of joy, and my father immediately started calling relatives. "We'll pay for everything," my mother exclaimed, wrapping Hannah in a celebratory hug. The message was clear. Hannah's wedding was a priority, and no expense would be spared. The following months were a whirlwind of wedding planning. Discussions about venues, flowers, and guest lists dominated every meal. Money was no object, with discussions of designer dresses and top-tier vendors. My grandparents attended the wedding but seemed taken aback by the lavish spending, evident in their tight smiles and quiet discomfort at the extravagant displays like the ice sculpture and champagne fountain. 3 years later, I sat at the dinner table with 3 college acceptance letters in front of me. Despite years of balancing extensive chores with maintaining excellent grades, I managed to get into my top universities. Excitedly, I shared the news with my parents. "That's nice," my mother responded without even looking up from her plate, "but we can't afford to send you. We spent our savings on your sister's wedding and even took out a loan. But you paid for Hannah's college. I protested, confused and hurt. That was different, she said coldly, implying Hannah had a potential they didn't see in me. The silence that followed was suffocating. My acceptance letters suddenly felt like a cruel joke. You should get a job, my father suggested indifferently, save some money, maybe take out a student loan. That's what responsible adults do. I left the table without permission, a bold act of defiance, and immediately called my grandmother. Tears blurred my vision as I made my way to their house, where I was met with hugs and comforting words. Between sobs, I poured out my frustrations and fears to my grandparents. My grandfather's expression hardened as he listened, but there was a flicker of something determined in his eyes. After I had calmed down, he and my grandmother exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Eliana," my grandfather began, his voice firm yet kind, "we've been expecting something like this." They explained that they had observed the disparity in treatment between Hannah and me over the years. Standing up, my grandfather retrieved a folder from his study. Inside were bank statements, the evidence of a fund they had been building since my birth, designated for my education. "You can choose any of those colleges," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "We've got you covered." That night, I returned home and packed the essentials, ready to start a new chapter. Downstairs, my parents were absorbed with the TV, barely noticing as I moved around. The reality of their indifference stung, but the promise of a future supported by those who truly valued me filled me with hope and determination. When I announced my decision to move in with my grandparents, my mother's response was nonchalant. "Whatever you think is best," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the television. Was there a hint of relief in her voice? The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of college prep. I decided to major in financial analysis, inspired in part by witnessing my parents' haphazard approach to managing their finances. My grandparents were instrumental in getting me ready, assisting with everything from application forms to shopping for my college supplies. Starting college that fall marked the beginning of a new chapter. The subjects were challenging, but I was invigorated by the learning process. Every lecture was a step further from my past and closer to a promising future. My professors quickly took note of my passion, and I often stayed after class to delve deeper into complex financial theories. For the first time, someone outside my immediate family recognized and encouraged my potential. In my sophomore year, during one of our regular phone chats, my grandmother shared some news about Hannah. "Your sister's having trouble," she revealed. Hannah's career in marketing was floundering, and Matthew was struggling to maintain steady employment. They frequently needed financial help, which my parents provided without hesitation. My grandmother sighed as she told me about the latest bailout involving my mother's retirement savings to cover their rent. A year later, the situation deteriorated further. Unable to afford their living expenses, even with continuous financial support, Hannah and Matthew moved back into my childhood bedroom, the room I had kept immaculate for so many years. The irony of it stung, yet it was a stark contrast to my circumstances. By then, I was excelling in my internships at prestigious financial institutions, gaining recognition for my knack for unraveling complex financial puzzles. My supervisor at Morgan Stanley was impressed, hinting at future opportunities with them. I remained focused on my studies, with my family rarely crossing my mind except during conversations with my grandparents. However, during a visit in my senior year, I immediately sensed something was off. The atmosphere was heavy, the usual warmth replaced by a forced cheerfulness from my grandmother and uncharacteristic silence from my grandfather. "What's wrong?" I pressed during dinner, noticing their evasive movements. After a moment of hesitance, my grandfather revealed the troubling truth. "Your parents came to us last week," he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. "They wanted their inheritance early."
"Why would they need that?"
I asked, setting down my fork. "They're in deep trouble with the banks," my grandmother explained. "Multiple loans, credit card debt. They said they needed $500,000 to stave off bankruptcy. And you gave it to them?" I couldn't hide my frustration. My grandfather nodded solemnly. "We had to, Eliana. They're still our children, and we couldn't just watch them fail." I was furious. After all the enabling of Hannah's irresponsibility and the indifferent treatment I had received, it was hard to accept their decision. But that was most of your savings. Sweetheart, my grandmother said, reaching across the table to grasp my hand gently. We know you're upset, but what's done is done. We'll manage. The dinner continued, but the air was thick with unspoken words and my unresolved feelings. Despite the turmoil, the support and sacrifice of my grandparents were evident, reinforcing the stark contrasts in familial love and responsibility I had experienced growing up. I couldn't shake my anger. My parents, who never prioritized my education and treated me more like a housekeeper than a daughter, had boldly asked my grandparents for money. This is despite their chronic inability to manage their finances or refuse anything to Hannah. Meanwhile, my dedication was paying dividends. After graduation, bolstered by strong recommendations from my professors and a series of successful internships, I secured a job at a prestigious financial firm in the city. The salary was beyond anything I had dared to dream of. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine, clean and secure. Each morning, I reveled in the simplicity of making breakfast just for myself, free from the demands of others. My career advanced rapidly. I embraced every challenge, earning promotions and bonuses that would have seemed fantastical to my younger self. Within a few years, I had saved enough for a down payment on a house. The day I signed the mortgage, my thoughts drifted to my family, still entangled in poor financial decisions, completely unaware of my achievements. We hadn't spoken in years. Then, out of the blue, I received a call that changed everything. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away by the time I got to the hospital. Less than 3 months later, my grandmother also passed away, seeming to have lost her will to live without him. During the funeral arrangements, I heard a voice behind me that I hadn't heard in years. It was my mother, looking worn and tired. Part of me wanted to send her away, but something in her weary eyes stopped me. Sure, I found myself saying, that would be nice. Over the next few days, as we planned the service together, my parents began to open up about their struggles. Retirement had hit them hard financially, and Hannah, now with twin boys, still relied heavily on them. A week after we laid my grandmother to rest, we gathered for the will reading in a wood-paneled office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and furniture polish. The tension was palpable. The notary, Mr. Carter, began to read in a monotone voice. I braced for standard legal phrases, but what followed caught everyone off guard. To our beloved granddaughter, Eliana, we leave our house and the sum of $230,000, he announced. The room fell silent, Hannah's jaw dropped, and my mother's hand clenched around my father's arm. Mr. Carter continued, and a personal note from Mr. Lincoln to his daughter, Sophie. He turned to my mother. Sophie, remember that we gave you $500,000 when you needed it most. This is our final decision, and we trust you will respect it as we respect your needs. My mother's face turned from red to pale. My father stared at the ground, and Hannah and Matthew exchanged anxious glances. After the reading, my parents approached me in the parking lot, their demeanor composed yet visibly shaken. They seemed about to speak, perhaps to explain themselves or to seek reconciliation. However, the moment was laden with a history of choices and consequences, a reminder of the divergent paths our lives had taken, guided by the values instilled in me by the very people who had now left me their legacy. Despite the display of cooperation during the funeral arrangements, any semblance of unity quickly dissolved, replaced by an almost desperate demeanor from my parents. Eliana, honey, my mother began, her voice trembling, you have to understand, we always thought we'd inherit the house. We were really counting on it. We're struggling. My father chimed in, his hand threading through his graying hair. With the mortgage, Hannah's family's expenses, we could really use the house. I looked at them, recalling the years of feeling unwanted and the clear neglect. Their refusal to support my education was still fresh in my mind. No, I said firmly. The house is mine. That's what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. They persisted, following me to my car, pleading their case. Hannah joined in too, arguing her boys needed a yard to play in. I didn't waver. I simply got into my car and drove away. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother asking me over for dinner. There was something different in her tone, perhaps a hint of humility. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Pulling up to my childhood home was like stepping into a dimly remembered past, only now everything appeared more run down than I recalled. The paint peeling, the gutters sagging, and the lawn overgrown. Inside, the house was crowded but clean. Hannah's twins, Roman and Axel, were a whirlwind of energy in the living room, their laughter echoing as Matthew half-heartedly attempted to calm them. "Eliana," my mother said, pulling me into an awkward hug, "we made your favorite, pot roast." "That's not my favorite," I corrected automatically. "That's Hannah's favorite." An uncomfortable silence fell, eventually broken by my father clearing his throat. "Well, why don't you tell us what your favorite food is? We'd love to know." Surprisingly, they were genuinely interested. Over dinner, they inquired about my job, my apartment, and my hobbies. They listened intently as I talked about my work in finance, although I could tell much of it went over their heads. That dinner led to another, and then another. Soon, I was joining them for holidays, bringing gifts for the twins, and even helping Hannah with their homework. Sometimes, when they mentioned that the house needed repairs, I offered to help. I paid for a new roof, fixed the heating system, and repainted the exterior. Each time I wrote a check, my parents would tear up with gratitude. "You're too good to us," my mother would say, embracing me. "We don't deserve this." "You're right," I would think, but never say it aloud. Despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe people could change. As the years passed and my career flourished, my investment portfolio grew substantially. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents seemed to strengthen. They were aging, both over 68 now, and I wanted to do something meaningful for them. "I've been thinking," I said during one of our Sunday dinners, observing my father's struggle to rise from his chair, "this house isn't really suitable for you anymore. I want to buy you a new house, something single-story with a nice garden but easier to maintain. Something comfortable for your retirement years." Their reaction was one of genuine joy, tears streaming down their faces. We spent the next few weeks house hunting together and finally found the perfect place, a beautiful ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood with wide doorways and no stairs. After closing, my parents couldn't stop talking about how excited they were. "We need to have a proper housewarming party," my father declared, his spirits lifted. "Let us arrange everything. It's the least we can do." "That would be lovely," I agreed, seeing this as a new beginning in our amended relationship, a blend of forgiveness and cautious optimism about our future interactions. I had planned to surprise my parents with a house deed at their big celebration, so I waited for an invite to mark my calendar. As weeks turned into months, I juggled a hectic work schedule, but kept an ear out for news of the party. Whenever I inquired, my mom would always say they were still ironing out the details, aiming for perfection. My dad would assure me, "We'll notify you soon," but their responses always seemed a bit off. Curiosity led me one night to search for my sister Hannah on Facebook, where I stumbled upon her recent post about a housewarming party happening that very Saturday. The pictures showed a beautifully decorated house and caterers preparing for the event. It was clear this had been planned well in advance. Feeling sidelined, I called my mom to casually confirm the party details. She glossed over my question, maintaining that the date hadn't been set yet. It became apparent I was deliberately left out. On the day, I parked a block from the house I had purchased for them. Laughter and music echoed down the street. Through the windows, I saw a house full of guests, enjoying the evening without me. I entered unnoticed and found my way to the living room where my father was proudly telling guests about their hard-earned dream home. My mom proudly mentioned how Hannah had helped significantly with the down payment, praising her generosity in front of the crowd. A guest commented on the importance of family support, prompting my mom to remark sharply, "Unlike some people, probably too busy with work to care about family." That was my cue. I interrupted. "Actually, I think there's been a misunderstanding." All eyes turned to me as I continued. "This house? I bought it. And it seems I've been forgotten in all these plans." The room fell silent. My father, attempting to recover, feigned surprise at my presence. I countered. Quite the surprise, considering I wasn't even invited to my own house's warming. Tensions rose as my mom defensively said, "Well, you bought it, but it's ours now. We can't be expected to thank you forever." My dad boldly added, "You're not welcome here. This is a family event, and it's Hannah and her family who will be living here." As they revealed Hannah had already sold her home, I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. I pulled out the deed from my bag and displayed it to the room. "You seem to be confused," I stated, showing everyone the document that proved my ownership. "This house is mine, and it seems there's been quite the mistake." I had never transferred the ownership of the house to my parents. I planned to officially hand it over to them at what I had hoped would be a joyful housewarming party. When I revealed the reality, that the house was still mine and not theirs as they had presumed, the color drained from my mother's face, turning it ghostly pale, while my father struggled for words. Facing the room full of shocked guests, I announced, "I would like everyone to please leave now. This is my house and the party is over." At this, my mother's disbelief erupted into a shrill protest. "You can't do this. We are your parents." I replied softly yet firmly, "No, you just brought me into this world. My real parents, my grandparents, taught me that family is more than just a genetic link. They also taught me how to handle my finances, which is why I am the owner of this house." With tears in their eyes, my parents, Hannah, Matthew, their twins, and all their friends slowly left. I stood on the front porch, watching as each car pulled away, leaving the street deserted. In the weeks that followed, I heard that they had used the proceeds from selling their previous home to purchase an apartment. Hannah, Matthew, and the twins moved in with my parents. They attempted to reach out to me several times, but I blocked their numbers, emails, and social media accounts. Eventually, I sold the house, depositing the proceeds into my bank account. This whole ordeal cemented a resolve in me. When I have children of my own, they will never have to vie for my affection or prove their worth for my love. Unlike my parents, I will cherish my children equally and unconditionally, just as my grandparents cherished me.
The Thompson family had a reputation to maintain. Old money, social connections, and impeccable taste were the pillars upon which Margaret Thompson built her identity. So when her only son David fell in love with me, a seemingly ordinary kindergarten teacher from a town no one in their circle had heard of, she made her disapproval crystal clear. "She seems nice," Margaret had said after our first meeting, the word nice carrying the weight of profound disappointment. "But honestly, David, what could you possibly have in common with someone so simple?" David defended me, of course. He loved that I was unpretentious and genuine, qualities in short supply among the social climbers he'd grown up around. But Margaret's campaign of subtle undermining continued for the 2 years we dated, reaching its peak when David proposed with his grandmother's ring. "Congratulations," Margaret had said coldly over the phone when David shared the news. "I suppose we'll need to start planning immediately. There's so much Sarah will need to learn about how things are done in our world." Our world. As if I were an alien visiting from another planet rather than someone born just 50 miles away. The wedding planning became Margaret's battlefield. Every decision, the venue, the caterer, the flowers, became an opportunity to highlight the gulf between my limited experience and the Thompson family standards. I tried to remain gracious, reminding myself that this was about marrying David, not winning his mother's approval. Then came the dress shopping expedition. Margaret had insisted we visit an exclusive bridal salon in the city where, she informed me, Thompson women had been selecting their wedding gowns for generations. The appointment had been scheduled months in advance, and Margaret had arranged for several of her closest friends to accompany us, women whose names regularly appeared in society pages and charity gala photographs. "It's tradition," she explained when I suggested keeping the shopping party smaller. "These women have known David since he was a child. Their opinion matters." What she really meant, of course, was that my opinion mattered less. The salon was exactly as intimidating as I'd expected. All crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes, with gowns displayed like museum pieces. The owner greeted Margaret with air kisses and exclamations about how long it had been since they'd seen each other. "And this must be the bride," she said, examining me with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, this is Sarah," Margaret replied. "We'll need something that flatters her figure. Perhaps something with sleeves, and nothing too fashion-forward. Something classic to elevate her natural simplicity." I bit my tongue as the salon staff measured me and discussed my challenging proportions, as if I weren't present. Margaret's friends sipped champagne and reminisced about their own wedding dresses, each apparently more exquisite than the last. After trying on 7 different gowns, each met with subtle grimaces and whispered consultations among Margaret's committee, I was exhausted and close to tears. "Perhaps we should continue another day," the salon owner suggested delicately. "Finding the perfect gown can be a process." That's when my phone rang. It was my mother. "Sarah, honey, I know you're busy with the Thompson dress shopping today, but I wanted to let you know that package we discussed arrived. It's even more beautiful than we hoped." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "That's wonderful news, Mom. I'll stop by later to see it." When I ended the call, Margaret was watching me with narrow-eyed suspicion. "A package? Something for the wedding?" she asked. "Just something my mother wanted me to see," I replied vaguely. "Speaking of which, I should probably wrap up here. Thank you all for your time and input." Margaret looked affronted. "But we haven't found anything suitable yet." "Sarah, this isn't like picking up something from a department store. A proper wedding gown requires time and consideration." "I understand," I said, summoning my kindergarten teacher patience. "And I appreciate everyone's help today. But I think I need some time to reflect on the options." 2 weeks later, Margaret called an emergency meeting at her home to discuss what she termed concerning developments with the wedding planning. David and I arrived to find her in the sunroom, surrounded by wedding magazines and sample table settings. "Sarah," she began without preamble, "I've heard disturbing rumors that you've purchased a wedding dress without proper consultation. Some off-the-rack item from a boutique in your hometown?" I took a deep breath. "I have found my dress, yes." Margaret's perfectly manicured hand fluttered to her throat. "But we haven't approved anything. The salon was preparing a selection of appropriate options for our next appointment." "I appreciate that, but I found something I love." "Well," Margaret said with forced brightness, "I'm sure it's nice. Perhaps we can have it altered by professionals to make it more suitable." "Where did you find this dress?" "Actually, it was my mother who found it." Margaret exchanged knowing glances with her friend Beatrice, who had apparently been summoned for moral support. "I see. Well, that explains a lot. I'm sure your mother meant well, but she couldn't possibly understand the standards expected at a Thompson wedding." David, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Mom, I'm sure Sarah's dress is beautiful, and ultimately, it's her decision." "Of course it is," Margaret replied with a tight smile. "I simply want to make sure Sarah doesn't feel uncomfortable when she's standing next to proper society brides in their photos. People notice these things." "Perhaps," Beatrice suggested with fake helpfulness, "we could see this dress, just to get a sense of what alterations might be needed." I hesitated, then nodded. "Actually, I brought it with me today. I thought you might want to see it." Margaret's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You brought it here?" "Today. It's in the car. I'll go get it." When I returned carrying a garment bag, Margaret had composed herself, clearly prepared to be diplomatic about whatever fashion disaster she expected to emerge. David squeezed my hand reassuringly as I unzipped the bag. The dress that emerged was a masterpiece of understated elegance, an ivory silk column with delicate beadwork along the neckline and a supple train. Even on the hanger, it was clearly something special. "What a shame your family couldn't afford something better," my future mother-in-law sneered, examining my wedding dress with obvious disappointment. "Everyone will know you don't belong in our circle." I stayed silent as she continued her critique. "It looks like a discount store knockoff," she declared, reaching for the collar. "The beadwork is clumsy, and this silk is clearly synthetic." When she flipped the collar to check the label, her face went completely white. "This is impossible." Because there, on the designer label, was a name even Margaret Thompson approached with reverence. Alessandro Ricci, the Italian designer whose creations were worn by royalty and whose waiting list was years long. "There must be some mistake," she stammered. This can't be authentic. How would you possibly? It's genuine, I confirmed quietly. A gift from my godmother. Your godmother? Beatrice echoed incredulously. Who exactly is your godmother? Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. David went to answer it, returning moments later with my mother and a woman Margaret clearly recognized immediately. Elena? Margaret gasped, rising to her feet. Elena Ritchie? What are you doing here? The woman who entered, elegant silver-haired, dressed in simple but exquisite linen, smiled warmly. Maggie Thompson. It's been 30 years? Still intimidating young brides, I see. Some things never change. My mother stepped forward, squeezing my shoulders supportively. I believe you've been getting to know my daughter, though perhaps not as well as you thought. Margaret looked between them in growing confusion. I don't understand. How do you know Elena Ritchie? Elena, the Elena Ritchie, sister of Alessandra and co-founder of their fashion empire, laughed lightly. Catherine and I were roommates at university before I moved back to Milan. She was the first American to model for our early collections. Model? Margaret repeated weakly, staring at my mother, the kindergarten teacher's aide from a small town who apparently had an entirely different past than the one Margaret had assumed. Just for a few years, my mother said modestly, before I met Sarah's father and decided to move back home. But Elena and I remained close. She's Sarah's godmother, and when she heard about the wedding, I insisted on designing her dress personally, Elena finished. Catherine was like a sister during those early struggling years. Her daughter is family. Margaret sank back into her chair, speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Her friend Beatrice was staring at my mother with newfound fascination. You're Catherine Jensen, the face of Ritchie's breakthrough '89 collection. I still have those magazine spreads. You disappeared from the fashion world so suddenly. My mother smiled. I found another calling, one that made me happier than the fashion world ever did. I felt David's arm slip around my waist as we watched his mother attempting to recalibrate everything she thought she knew. So you see, Margaret, I said gently, while I appreciate your guidance with the wedding planning, I do have some resources of my own. And more importantly, I know exactly who I am and where I come from, even if you've made some incorrect assumptions. The silence that followed was broken by Elena, who clapped her hands decisively. Shall we discuss the rest of the wedding party? I've brought some sample designs for the mother of the groom. Something that would complement Sarah's dress beautifully, Maggie, if you're interested. 2 days later, David and I were having dinner at my parents' modest but comfortable home, the home where I'd grown up, surrounded by photographs of my mother's brief but significant modeling career alongside pictures of school plays and soccer tournaments. I've never seen my mother speechless before, David marveled, helping my father grill vegetables in the backyard. She's been almost deferential since meeting your mom and Elena. My father laughed. Catherine has that effect on people when they discover her past. She never made a big deal of it. That's not her style. But she was quite something in her day. Still is. I called from the patio table where I was helping my mother set up dinner. My mother smiled. The funny thing is, Margaret and I probably would have found common ground if she'd bothered to ask rather than assume. We both left high-profile worlds to focus on family. We both value education and community, but she was so busy sizing me up for where I fit in her social hierarchy that she never saw me at all. The wedding planning shifted dramatically after what David jokingly called the dress revelation. Margaret didn't exactly become warm, but her approach changed from condescension to careful respect. She consulted rather than dictated, and occasionally even deferred to my mother's connections, which turned out to include not just Elena Ritchie, but several other notable figures from her previous life. On the day of the wedding, as my mother helped me into the exquisite dress that had caused such a stir, I reflected on the unexpected gift Margaret's snobbery had delivered, the chance to bridge two parts of my family history and to claim my own identity in the process. You know, my mother said, adjusting my veil, in all my years wearing runway creations, I never felt as beautiful in a dress as I know you will today, because today you're marrying for love, not for appearance. When I walked down the aisle toward David, I passed Margaret in the front row. For once, her focus wasn't on how things looked to others or whether standards were being maintained. Instead, there were tears in her eyes as she watched her son's face light up at the sight of me. At the reception, Elena Ritchie raised a toast that perfectly captured the journey we'd all taken. To David and Sarah, and to the two families joining today. May you all discover, as I have throughout my career, that true elegance comes not from labels or pedigrees, but from authenticity, kindness, and the courage to see beyond first impressions. Margaret, seated beside Elena at the head table, actually clinked glasses with my mother at these words. Later, as David and I danced under the stars, he whispered, "You know what my favorite part of that dress is?" "What?" I asked, expecting him to comment on the exquisite beadwork or perfect fit. That underneath all its fancy pedigree, it's being worn by the down-to-earth kindergarten teacher I fell in love with. The one who knows exactly who she is, with or without designer labels. I kissed him, grateful for a partner who had seen me clearly from the beginning, something his mother was only now learning to do. 6 months after the wedding, Margaret invited my mother and me to tea at her home. The pretension that had characterized our earlier visits was noticeably absent as she led us to a sun-dappled patio rather than a formal drawing room. "I've been doing some thinking," she said, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about first impressions and hidden depths, about how we present ourselves to the world and what we choose to reveal." My mother and I exchanged surprised glances as Margaret continued. "Catherine, when we first met, I made assumptions based on your current life, never imagining your past experiences. I judged Sarah through the same limited lens." She paused, clearly finding this difficult. "The truth is, before I married into the Thompson family, my background was much closer to yours than anyone in my social circle knows. My father owned a hardware store. I worked as a sales clerk through college." This revelation stunned us both. Margaret Thompson, the arbiter of old money social standards, had reinvented herself just as thoroughly as my mother had, but in the opposite direction. When I met Philip Thompson, I was determined to fit into his world perfectly. I studied how the right people dressed, spoke, entertained. I erased every trace of my origins until I convinced even myself that I'd always belonged. She looked at me directly. "When David brought you home, Sarah, I didn't see a wonderful woman who made my son happy. I saw a reminder of everything I'd worked to distance myself from. I was terrified you might expose the fraud I sometimes still feel like." Margaret. My mother said gently, "We all create different versions of ourselves throughout our lives. There's no shame in transformation." "The shame," Margaret replied, "is in denying where we came from, in treating others as less worthy because of where we think they belong in some imaginary hierarchy." She reached across the table and, in an unprecedented gesture, covered my hand with hers. "I hope you'll give me the chance to be a better mother-in-law than I've been so far, and perhaps a friend in time." As we drove home afterward, my mother and I tried to process this unexpected turn. "Do you think she's sincere?" I asked. "Yes," my mother said thoughtfully. "Recognition is a powerful thing. Sometimes people need to see themselves reflected in unexpected places before they can acknowledge their own truth. Like seeing a kindergarten teacher in an Alessandra Ritchie original?" My mother laughed. "Exactly, but the dress didn't change who you are, Sarah. It just helped Margaret see past her own prejudice. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all. Not the designer dress or the social connections, but the reminder that our true worth has nothing to do with labels, whether they're sewn into a wedding gown or attached to a family name." A year later, when I discovered I was pregnant, Margaret was among the first people we told. Her eyes filled with tears as she hugged me, a genuine embrace without concern for appearances. "This child," she said, "will have the best of all worlds. Thompson determination, Jensen creativity, and parents who know the value of authenticity." As we left her home that evening, David squeezed my hand. "Who would have thought a wedding dress could change so much?" "Not the dress," I corrected him, "the willingness to look beyond it."
My name is Macy. I come from what many would consider a typical family. A mother, a father, and my older sister Deborah, who is 6 years older than I am. That age gap set the tone for our family dynamics. Growing up, our home felt like a museum dedicated to Deborah's milestones, her first smile, her first steps, and her early drawings, which my parents adored and displayed like masterpieces. In contrast, I seemed to blend into the background, wearing Deborah's hand-me-downs and playing with her discarded toys. It wasn't the ideal situation, but I didn't know any different. I learned early on to stay quiet and avoid drawing attention to myself. As time passed, this pattern persisted. Deborah received new clothes and toys, while I got her leftovers. Yet, I never voiced any complaints. I simply existed. High school came and went, and Deborah moved out to attend college on a scholarship. I hoped that might turn my parents' attention my way, but their focus remained fixed on Deborah's college experiences, her new boyfriend, and her burgeoning future. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Deborah returned home bursting with excitement, announcing her engagement. The reaction from my parents was as if she had achieved something monumental. Tears, cheers, and laughter filled the room, and amidst it all, Deborah turned to me, her eyes sparkling, asking if I'd be her bridesmaid. I nodded and mustered a smile, though inside I felt overlooked as usual. Deborah's wedding preparations became a family affair marked by grandeur and financial strain. My parents even considered taking out a loan to cover the costs. I overheard them one evening, their voices laden with stress, yet resolved to support Deborah's big day. I felt a pang of injustice, but kept my opinions to myself, as they seemed to carry little weight. The wedding itself was extravagant. Deborah was the radiant center of attention, and our parents glowed with pride. There, in my bridesmaid dress, I felt more invisible than ever. After returning from her honeymoon, Deborah announced her decision to become a housewife, since her husband's income was sufficient for them both. Despite the financial burden they'd already shouldered for her wedding, our parents simply smiled and supported her choice. My frustrations simmered silently. Not long after, Deborah revealed she was expecting twins. Our parents were overjoyed and began planning to help them buy a larger home for their expanding family. When they talked about making a down payment on a house, despite the existing wedding debt, I couldn't hold back any longer. I finally spoke up, questioning their decisions amidst our financial realities. Growing up in Deborah's shadow, I always felt like an afterthought in my own family's narrative. My voice, often muted by the louder storylines around me, struggled to find its place. But in that moment of dissent, I realized the weight of my presence and the need to advocate for myself, even if it meant challenging the family norms that had so long defined us. And so I proposed buying them a house. They both glanced at me, seeming to have forgotten I was even present. Perhaps they truly had. "Macy," Mom spoke up firmly, "this is what families do. We support one another." Not long after, the twins arrived, two delightful little boys who were the apple of everyone's eye. Mom and Dad were ecstatic, spending every possible moment at Deborah's new place, doting on the infants. Meanwhile, I was wrapping up high school, pondering over what came next. College seemed the natural path, but funding it was the real puzzle. One evening, I gathered the nerve to discuss college finances with my parents. "I've been exploring colleges," I initiated. "That's nice, dear," Mom replied, distracted by the twins' photo album she was assembling. "Could you guys possibly help with the tuition?" I asked tentatively. They exchanged that familiar, uncomfortable look, the one that suggested they wished to discuss anything but this. "Well, honey," Dad began reluctantly, "we'd love to support you. But after the wedding loan for Deborah and the down payment for her house, we can only cover half." Mom quickly added, "You'll have to manage the rest on your own." I felt a profound sense of disappointment. They could only offer half after all they'd done for Deborah. Resigned, I thanked them quietly and retreated to my room. Behind the closed door, I allowed myself to cry for the first time in years. I enrolled in the local community college, not my first choice, but the only option feasible with the limited financial help. To bridge the gap, I took a part-time job at a diner. Balancing work and studies was a relentless challenge. I returned home exhausted nightly, longing for sleep that was too often interrupted. On Friday, after an especially tough shift, all I craved was my bed. But as I entered, there was Deborah in the living room, the twins in tow. "Oh, Macy, you're a lifesaver," she sighed, rushing out for a date night before I could protest, leaving me with her restless toddlers. "What the—" I muttered, feeling overwhelmed. I cherished my nephews, but this wasn't my responsibility. Mom appeared, justifying. "Your sister's worn out. Macy. This is family. Plus, it's good practice for when you have your own kids. This pattern persisted. Every weekend, Deborah would appear, leave the twins, and vanish. Sometimes she ran errands, other times it was a movie or dinner out. Each time, I was left to babysit. Finally, after a brutal exam week, I reached my breaking point. This isn't fair, I protested to my parents. I'm exhausted from work and school, and now my weekends too? Dad didn't even glance up from his newspaper. Macy, your sister needs the support. You should be happy to help, but what about what I need? I protested, feeling worn thin from the relentless pace of my life. Mom sighed heavily. Macy, don't be selfish. Deborah has 2 children to manage. You don't understand how tough that is. It was evident they weren't going to take my concerns seriously, so I resigned myself to the role they had imposed on me, attending classes by day, working at the diner in the evenings, and serving as an unpaid babysitter during the weekends. Any notion of a personal life was laughable. The extent of my social interactions was the brief chats with customers. Romantic dates were a distant fantasy. I barely had a moment to myself, let alone time to meet someone new. I was nearing my breaking point. Juggling work, school, and unsolicited babysitting duties had left me utterly drained, both physically and emotionally. I desperately needed a real break, away from every demand and expectation. So I made a decision. One evening, I declared to my parents, I'm taking a few days off. I'm going to the beach. To my surprise, they responded positively. That's wonderful, Macy's. Mom exclaimed, genuinely pleased. Where are you going? I shared details about a modest motel I had found online by the ocean. It was simple and affordable. Dad nodded in approval. Good for you, kiddo. You deserve a break. Their support was so unexpected it nearly knocked me off my feet. Could it be that they were finally recognizing my needs? The day of my departure arrived, and I felt a palpable sense of relief as I boarded the bus, the weight of my responsibilities diminishing with each mile. When I reached the coast, the sight of the rundown motel didn't dampen my spirits. The ocean view was breathtaking. I dropped off my bag and headed straight to the beach. The salty breeze was invigorating, clearing my mind. I enjoyed a leisurely lunch at a quaint seaside cafe, relishing the quiet and the rhythmic sound of the waves. As the sun began to set, I walked back to the motel, planning a peaceful evening alone. However, as I neared my room, the sound of familiar voices stopped me in my tracks. There, outside the room next to mine, were Mom and Deborah, with the twins racing around them. Surprise, Macy. My heart sank. What are you doing here? I managed to ask, my disappointment evident. We couldn't let you be all alone on your vacation, Mom said cheerily. So we decided to join you. We're right next door. I noticed their suitcases outside one of the nicer rooms. They had obviously chosen a more expensive option for themselves. Before I could react, Deborah was pushing the twins towards me. The boys have been dying to see the ocean. You don't mind watching them for a bit, do you? I want to take a walk on the beach, and I need to run to the store, Mom added. Just like that, they were gone, leaving me standing there with 2 hyperactive 4-year-olds. What was meant to be a rejuvenating getaway turned into a nightmare. The twins were unruly, turning my modest room into a disaster area. They tore curtains, broke glasses, and managed to clog the toilet with toys, leaving me to handle the aftermath and unexpected expenses. By the end of what was supposed to be my vacation, I was even more exhausted than before, a stark reminder that my needs were still an afterthought to my family. But I was more content than ever before. The final breaking point came when Deborah complained about being tired from the trip. That was too much. The argument that erupted was monumental. I shouted, Mom wept, Deborah became defensive, and the twins wailed through it all. That night, I packed and caught the first bus home at dawn. Watching the coastline vanish, I sensed a pivotal shift within me. I couldn't let this pattern continue. Dragged down by exhaustion, I entered through the front door. Dad was in his usual spot, glued to the TV, offering barely a grunt as I passed. Collapsing into bed, my mind spun with turbulent emotions and budding resolutions. By morning, clarity had formed. I was leaving. I was midway through packing when the door slammed shut. Mom's voice, sharp and fraught, echoed through the house. "Macy, where are you?" She found me in my room, her face flushed with anger. "I can't believe you just left us there. Do you know how hard it was to handle the twins by ourselves?" I nearly retorted about my constant solo babysitting, but chose silence instead. "What are you doing?" she demanded, eyes narrowing. "I'm moving out," I stated, more composed than I felt. "I need my own space, my own life." Their reactions were swift, and as expected. "How can you be so selfish?" Mom cried. "After all we've done for you." Dad's face reddened with fury. "You ungrateful girl. What about your sister? Who will help her with the twins?" That was the last straw. My sister? What about me? When has anyone in this family ever considered what I need? I challenged. Mom gasped. "Deborah has a husband. Let him help with the kids. I need to focus on my life. If you leave, don't expect any more financial support for college. You'll be completely on your own," Dad growled. I faced them, seeing them as if for the first time, not just as my parents but as individuals oblivious to my needs. "Fine," I said, zipping up my suitcase. "I'd rather be on my own than continue living like this. No personal life, no time to myself, just endless demands and nonstop chaos. I'm done." I pushed past them, suitcase in tow, their protests echoing behind me. As I reached the door, Mom's voice pierced the turmoil. "If you leave now, don't bother coming back." I paused, hand on the doorknob, then without a backward glance, stepped into a new beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. I crashed on a classmate's couch while I searched for a stable living situation. Soon, I found a potential roommate for my study group. We secured a modest apartment, barely affordable but ours. Cut off financially, I picked up extra shifts at the diner, balancing work and school. There were nights I doubted my endurance, overwhelmed by fatigue. Yet, for the first time, I experienced true freedom. No demands, no guilt trips over babysitting, no putting everyone else's needs before my own. The apartment was humble, my bed just a mattress on the floor, but it was a sanctuary. Here, I began to rebuild my life, finally prioritizing myself. I committed myself entirely to my studies, driven by an intensity that surprised even me. Countless sleepless nights, missed gatherings, and extra shifts were all sacrifices made in pursuit of my dream. Before I realized it, 3 years flew by, and there I was at graduation, scanning the crowd for any familiar faces, my parents or my sister Deborah. Sadly, the seats I'd reserved remained vacant. After college, life shifted dramatically. I secured a position at a marketing firm, and for the first time, I wasn't just scraping by. I had a steady income. I rented an apartment of my own, modest, but mine alone, free from roommates and family drama. It felt like a breath of fresh air. I began to enjoy simple pleasures, going on dates, making new friends, and experiencing casual relationships. Though these were lighthearted, they brought joy to my previously overburdened life. My relationship with my parents, however, was strained. We spoke infrequently, our conversations filled with awkward pauses and subtle disapproval, mainly because they hadn't approved of my decision to move out. When my 27th birthday approached, my mom, unusually upbeat, invited me to celebrate at home with the entire family. Against my better judgment, I accepted. Arriving at my parents' home was like traveling back in time. My sister Deborah, her husband, and their energetic 6-year-old twins were there, along with various aunts, uncles, and cousins, all greeting me warmly. While I managed a polite smile and accepted their gifts, the atmosphere changed when my mom presented me with a grand gesture, an envelope containing a ticket to a beach resort for a family vacation. I felt trapped. Memories of past obligations flooded back, reminding me of lost personal time due to family commitments. At the party's end, with just the immediate family left, I couldn't hold back any longer. I declared firmly that I wouldn't go, igniting a flurry of emotions and accusations of not caring about the family. Despite the intense pressure and guilt-tripping, I relented, exhausted, agreeing to go. As the departure day arrived, Surrounded by my overly enthusiastic family at the airport, I realized they were unaware of the reservations I still harbored about this trip. They thought they had won, but I knew this vacation would be a test of my patience and boundaries with my family. As I sat with my family in the bustling airport, my sister Deborah cheerfully laid out the plans for the vacation. "You'll have such fun with the boys, Aunt Macy," she said with a wink, suggesting beach days, sandcastles, and snorkeling. Our parents shared her enthusiasm, expressing how wonderful it would be for Deborah to have a break. Yet, throughout their excited chatter, not once did anyone consider what I might want from the vacation. It was clear they all viewed me merely as a convenient babysitter. When we neared the check-in counter, I seized my opportunity. "Oh," I exclaimed, feigning discomfort. "I need to use the restroom. You guys go ahead and check in. I'll meet you at the gate." They nodded, preoccupied with their luggage and the excited children. As they joined the line, I turned and briskly walked the other way. My heart raced as I approached a different airline counter, where I presented my passport and a ticket I had secretly purchased weeks before, a ticket to a small, serene island resort. Once through security, I found a secluded spot and pulled out my phone, my hands trembling slightly as I composed a message to my mother. "I'm not going on the family vacation. I've planned my trip. Enjoy yours." I sent the message and turned off my phone, bracing myself for the inevitable backlash. As I boarded the plane to my chosen destination, I briefly turned on my phone, which immediately flooded with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, and texts filled with anger and disbelief. I listened to a voicemail from my mother, her voice shrill and furious, berating me for ruining the family plans and calling me selfish and ungrateful. As the plane lifted off, I sipped my champagne and stared out the window. Despite a knot of guilt in my stomach, a profound sense of freedom overwhelmed me. I knew the fallout would come: angry calls, tearful accusations, and more labels of selfishness. Yet I felt light, liberated to breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. This trip was solely for me. No babysitting, no family obligations, just relaxation and self-indulgence. Landing on the tropical island, the warm breeze greeted me like a breath of fresh air, whispering of new beginnings. I checked into a quaint, charming resort by the beach and settled in. Curiosity eventually compelled me to check my phone again, which was still bombarded with furious messages. With a mix of amusement and relief, I scrolled through the accusations of selfishness from my family. For once, I had chosen my own needs over their demands. I switched off the phone, locked it in the hotel safe, and decided I would be unreachable for the duration of my stay. What a glorious week it was. I relaxed on the beach, read uninterrupted, tried snorkeling, and even took up surfing. I mingled with other vacationers, enjoyed spontaneous dates, and reveled in the freedom of staying out late. No schedules, no responsibilities, and no obligations, just me, the ocean, and whatever adventure I decided to embrace next. After a rejuvenating day listening to the soothing sounds of the sea, I returned to my urban sanctuary more relaxed than I had been in a long while. This newfound serenity, however, was disrupted the following morning by a vehement knocking at my door. Upon opening it, I was met with the angry faces of my mother and sister, their expressions fraught with outrage. "You've gone too far this time," my mother exclaimed as she barged in without waiting for an invitation. Deborah followed closely behind, her voice sharp with reprimand. "You've completely spoiled our family trip." The children were utterly disappointed. They continued in this vein, bombarding me with grievances. According to them, I was inconsiderate, neglectful, and a disappointment as both a daughter and a sister. They insisted I was indebted to them for the holiday expenses and for neglecting my babysitting duties. I allowed them a moment to air their frustrations, their bitter words floating around me, yet not settling. When I sensed a pause, I interjected firmly. "Enough." My tone was clear and resolute. "I owe you nothing. Not for the trip, not for childcare, not for my time. I am my person, entitled to make my own choices." My mother attempted to interject, but I stopped her with a gesture. "This conversation is over. You may leave now." We can speak again when you're ready to approach me with respect and discuss things calmly. Until then, it's better if we don't talk." Their expressions registered shock at my decisiveness. After a few more sharp words, they left in a huff. Closing the door behind them, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confrontation but also a deep sense of rightness about standing up for myself. In the following weeks, I embraced change. I moved to a quieter part of the city, keeping my new address private for my family. I devoted myself more fully to my career and embraced hobbies that brought me joy and fulfillment, such as painting, practicing yoga, and beginning to learn a new language. There were challenging moments and times filled with self-doubt and guilt, but each time I returned to my serene home, made plans without the burden of family obligations, or explored a new interest, I felt reassured about my choices. The future between my family and me remains uncertain. There may come a time when reconciliation is possible, or perhaps it isn't in our cards. What is certain, though, is that I will face whatever comes, guided by my values and convictions, proudly forging the path I've chosen for my life. My name is Maya. I was raised by two down-to-earth parents who, through consistent hard work, amassed considerable savings, yet chose to live like any typical middle-class family. Perhaps that's why I turned out the way I did, practical, somewhat reserved, and more comfortable with numbers and coding than with casual conversation. It was after a particularly grueling week of debugging software that my phone vibrated. It was Eloise, a friend from my college days when life seemed far less complicated. "Hey Maya, it's been a while. Are you free this Saturday? There's this nostalgic river cruise you should join," she suggested. Normally, I'd have looked for any excuse to decline, but Eloise's timing was impeccable. I was in dire need of a change from my regular routine of coffee and coding, so I accepted. The sun was setting as I reached the pier. The cruise ship was an endearing, albeit slightly weathered vessel that seemed as if it had seen its share of adventures. Boarding the ship, I felt distinctly out of place in my baggy sweater and worn jeans amid a lively crowd dressed for a festive evening. I found a quiet spot on the deck, and as the ship began to move, the air filled with music and laughter. Nursing my drink, I felt the social gap between me and the others widen. Then he appeared, Hayden. I didn't know his name yet, but his loud laughter and easy charm were unmistakable. He navigated the crowd with a grace I envied. Just then, Eloise reappeared, her timing as perfect as ever. "Maya, you really should meet someone," she said, and before I knew it, she had fetched Hayden. "Hey," he greeted me with that effortless smile, pulling up a chair. "Eloise tells me you're in tech. That's cool. I can hardly update my apps without help," he chuckled. His words might have felt dismissive, but his tone was genuinely admiring, and to my surprise, I found myself laughing. "I do a bit more than just updates," I replied. "It's not glamorous, though. Lots of late nights staring at screens." Our conversation flowed naturally from work to hobbies, a rarity for me when meeting someone new. Hayden didn't seem to mind that I wasn't a part of the usual, vibrant crowd. As the evening unfolded under the warm glow of the ship's lights and the distant city skyline, we were both surprised when the announcement came that we were heading back to the pier. "We should do this again," Hayden suggested as we docked, asking for my number. Surprisingly, I found myself agreeing and typing my number into his phone. Hayden was true to his word and called the very next day. "Hey Maya, free for dinner this week? There's this quirky little diner I think you'll like." Intrigued, I agreed. The diner was a cozy spot, tucked away on a side street, adorned with vintage memorabilia and the soft sounds of old hits from a jukebox. It was perfectly laid back, with no pretensions. As we settled in, Hayden's charm was in full swing, intuitively guessing my preferences as if he had known me for years. It was both flattering and a little surprising how comfortable I felt. I lightly joked, "You get me, don't you?" as the waitress set down our milkshakes, his chocolate and mine strawberry, exactly how I prefer. "Hey, I pay attention," he replied with a wink, encouraging me to dive into details about the app one was developing. I shared about my latest project, simplifying the technical details. Hayden seemed more intrigued by the stories behind the coding, and his interest in me as a person was apparent. As we wrapped up our meal, he insisted, "Dinner's on me tonight. You can get the next one." It was a small offer, but it felt significant, a simple pact between us that continued to define our relaxed and spontaneous dates. A few months into our relationship, Hayden suggested we meet his parents. I was understandably nervous, but he reassured me. They're laid back. "You'll see." His parents resided in an affluent neighborhood, their home both spacious and impeccably decorated. We were greeted with warm smiles and ushered into a living room that could have been featured in a home decor magazine. "Maya, lovely to finally meet you," his mother, Cora, said as she embraced me. "Hayden has told us so much about you." Dinner was an elegant affair, but soon, the conversation took a probing turn. His father, Tyler, led with, "So, Maya, Hayden tells us you're in tech. That must be good money." As I nodded, playing it cool, "It's a growing field." "I've been fortunate," Cora added, with a scrutinizing look, "and they pay well at your company? Must be nice being so young and independent." I responded, "Yeah, it's decent," and focused on my meal. Hayden gave me a reassuring nudge under the table, signaling to keep things light. As the evening progressed, the questions subtly shifted towards my family background. "And your parents, what did they do?" Tyler inquired, wine glass in hand. "They're retired now. My dad used to run a small business," I explained. Cora's expression fleetingly dropped. "Oh, interesting," she said, her disappointment barely masked. "They must be proud of you making your own way." The rest of the evening was filled with more superficial chatter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been subtly interrogated. On the drive home, I mentioned to Hayden, "Your folks sure ask a lot about money," trying to keep the tone light. Hayden chuckled, "That's just them being curious, don't worry about it." Yet, something felt off, as if they were assessing me, gauging something more than just how well I meshed with their son. My parents lived in a modest, cozy home, the kind you might overlook but filled with warmth and genuine contentment. As Hayden and I arrived, my father stood by the door, his expression hard to read. "This is it," Hayden remarked, scanning the simple setting. "Yep, this is home," I affirmed with a forced smile. "It's not large, but it's full of heart." Inside, my mom had prepared a humble spread of home-cooked meals, the kind Hayden wasn't accustomed to. My dad reached out with a firm handshake. We settled in the living room, and the conversation felt awkward, the atmosphere charged with an unspoken tension. Hayden's gaze wandered, taking in the dated decor and family photos on the shelves. "So, Mr. Tucker, Maya told me you used to run a business. What was it?" he inquired, his curiosity tinged with an undertone that seemed more about sizing up than genuine interest. My dad chuckled, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, a little of this, a little of that." Hayden's father had spent most of his career in trucking before retiring, a straightforward, unglamorous job. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tucker had always been a homemaker. As Hayden glanced around, his eyes briefly met mine, seemingly searching for any flaws in my family's background. My mother responded with a radiant smile, her demeanor undisturbed by the subtle tensions. "It's been a fulfilling life, not centered around money, but around our close-knit family," she declared. I could see the tension in my father's expression as Hayden responded with a polite nod, clearly unimpressed. Dinner passed quietly, with Hayden offering compliments on the meal, though the conversation soon dwindled once again. After dinner, as we escorted Hayden to his car, my father whispered, "Think about what I said, Maya. There's no rush on the wedding." His concerned gaze lingered as I hugged him, but my emotions for Hayden blinded me to any caution. Our wedding was precisely as I had envisioned, simple and intimate. We exchanged vows in a quaint chapel, surrounded by a handful of friends and relatives. The day was about our commitment, not the spectacle. Post-ceremony, we settled into my modern apartment, which I had invested in heavily. Hayden was genuinely thrilled as he explored every corner. "This is all ours now, huh?" he remarked, embracing me from behind as we admired the cityscape from our living room window. Ours, I confirmed, leaning into his warmth, feeling a new chapter of our life begin. Life with Hayden soon fell into a comfortable routine where my higher income was just another element of our daily life. It never bothered me. I loved my job and was happy that it provided more than just personal fulfillment. It brought stability. His parents, Cora and Tyler, were always kind to me, particularly during holidays and their birthdays, perhaps because I never hesitated with gifts, a fancy blender for Mother's Day, and a high-end drill set for Father's Day, among others. As Christmas approached, gift expectations seemed to escalate. We were at their house, enjoying coffee, when Cora casually hinted, Maya, Tyler, and I have been thinking about getting new phones. The latest models just came out. I almost choked on my coffee. Those are pretty pricey, aren't they? I remarked. Cora, not breaking eye contact, replied, yes, but nothing but the best for us, right? I hesitated, feeling the trap set before me. Of course, but don't you think those phones are a bit excessive for what you use them for? It's more sensible to consider less expensive options. Cora's expression hardened. Sensible or cheap? Hayden suddenly stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Mom's right. Why are you being like this, Maya? It's Christmas. Cornered. I stood my ground. I'm not trying to be cheap. I just don't see the point in splurging on tech that isn't essential. It's wasteful. Hayden's response was icy. So, caring for my parents is wasteful now, he retorted. Before I could explain, he was already heading for the door, his demeanor distant and curt in the days that followed. Caught in turmoil, not wanting to lose him, yet stifled by the unfairness of it all, I eventually capitulated. I purchased the smartphones, top of the line, one for each of them. When I presented the beautifully wrapped gift boxes to Cora and Tyler, their reactions were almost humorous. Oh, Maya, you really didn't have to, Cora gushed, her tone laced with a hint of triumph. Tyler, beaming, clapped me on the back. That's my girl. Knew you'd come through. Hayden's demeanor suddenly brightened. He hugged me, whispering his thanks as if the past week's tension filled with silent meals and cold shoulders had never happened. Everything unraveled on a seemingly normal day. I was at my desk early, working through my second coffee and scanning lines of code, when Mr. Maxwell unexpectedly called us into the conference room. His voice trembled as he broke the news. Team, I'll be direct, the company is bankrupt. We're closing down effective immediately. The room fell into a stunned silence. Bankrupt. My job, my income, it all seemed to disintegrate before my eyes. I held myself together until I reached home, where I hoped Hayden's presence might reassure me. Hayden, I began, my voice wavering. The company, we're bankrupt. I've lost my job. Initially shocked, Hayden's face quickly hardened. You can find another job, right? Something that pays well. His immediate concern for money over my well-being stung, but I brushed it aside. I'll try, I replied, but it might take some time. The ensuing months blurred into a relentless cycle of job applications and interviews. Each mention of my last company's bankruptcy seemed to taint the interviewer's perceptions, as if misfortune was infectious. Our finances dwindled, our savings evaporated, and soon, the inevitable happened. We couldn't afford our apartment's rent any longer. Hayden suggested, quite casually, we should move in with my parents until you find something. It makes sense. Living with his parents turned out to be far from easy. Cora and Tyler's warmth disappeared the moment they realized I was no longer the financial powerhouse I had been. Meals became tense, peppered with not-so-subtle comments about the hard times and the need for me to contribute more. One evening, while I was wrapping up some freelance work, Cora advised, Maya, dear, try to keep the showers short, will you? Water bills aren't cheap, you know. Dinner that night felt like a trial. Before I even began eating, Tyler started, Maya, we're happy to help you too, but having you here does bring extra expenses. We're not a bank. My fork paused in midair. I understand, I replied. I'm trying to find work. It's just been tough. Hayden remained silent, his quiet adding a suffocating weight to the already heavy atmosphere. Hayden's patience thinned. He snapped over trivial things like unwashed dishes or lights left on. One evening, after another disappointing day of job rejections for me, he exploded. "Why can't you just find a job?" he yelled. "I'm trying, Hayden." "It's not like I'm not trying," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "Well, try harder. This isn't working. You sitting at home, and I'm stuck here because of you." His words felt like a slap. This was not the same man who had vowed to support me through thick and thin. Every day, the demeaning comments from Cora about freeloaders and Tyler's frequent complaints about supporting me chipped away at my spirit. I felt increasingly isolated and trapped. I longed to call my parents, craving even a few words of comfort in this relentless storm. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Their daughter was living like this, dependent and despised. It would shatter their hearts. Cora's birthday dinner was meant to be a small, cozy affair, an opportunity to celebrate within the close-knit circle of family at a nice downtown restaurant. However, I should have tempered my expectations, knowing all too well the absence of warmth in what had become a daily battle to preserve my dignity. As we entered the restaurant, the atmosphere was thick with artificial pleasantries. Cora radiated joy, relishing being the center of attention, while Tyler discussed the pricey wine he planned to order. Hayden was oddly cheerful, laughing exaggeratedly at every minor jest his parents made. As we settled at our table and the waiter distributed the menus, I immediately noticed that mine was different, thinner. Perplexed, I opened it to find a significantly more restricted selection. I glanced around to see Hayden and his parents perusing a variety of gourmet options. "Why do I have a different menu?" I asked, striving to maintain a composed voice. Hayden peeked at my menu and smirked. "Oh, that's the budget menu. We thought it would be more suitable for you right now," he said. Cora laughed lightly, adding, "Yes, with no job, you shouldn't be looking at the expensive meals. We have to economize somewhere." Tyler joined in with a boisterous laugh. "Exactly. Maybe just stick to the bread and water," as their words cut deep. Hayden chuckled along with his parents, treating it all as a grand joke. The humiliation scorched my cheeks, and I felt the piercing stares of other diners, some even whispering and pointing their phones in our direction. "I'm not just some freeloader." I stood up, my hands trembling. "When I had money, you all loved the gifts I bought. You loved going out and ordering whatever you wanted because I was paying. And now, I'm just a burden to you?" The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on our table. Hayden reached for my arm, attempting to pull me back into my seat. "Maya, stop this now, you're overreacting," he implored. I jerked my arm away, gathering my purse. "No, I'm done. I'm done being the punchline to your cruel jokes." With every eye in the restaurant on us, Hayden and his parents sat frozen, their faces flushed with embarrassment as murmurs filled the air. I walked out, the cool night air striking my face, a mix of relief and dread churning in my stomach. I didn't return to the celebration. Instead, I went straight to their house, my hands shaking as I hastily packed my bags, throwing in everything essential. The drive back to my parents' house was a journey filled with mixed emotions. The last few months had drained me, and returning to my childhood home felt both like a defeat and a sanctuary. I found my dad in his usual spot, the old recliner in the living room, reading a newspaper. He looked up, his face shifting from surprise to concern as he saw my state. "Maya, what happened?" he asked, his voice steady yet filled with worry. I sank onto the sofa, the weight of everything suddenly too much. "Dad, it's all gone wrong. Hayden, his parents, they were just using me. And now I've lost my job, my marriage, everything." Dad set his newspaper aside, his brow furrowed.
I saw it, Maya.
"I saw it from the start, but you had to see it for yourself. They were freeloaders, parasites." Tears welled up as his words confirmed my worst fears. "I feel so foolish," I whispered. "But now I've got nothing left," I said, feeling the weight of my world collapsing. Dad leaned forward, his gaze intensifying as he looked at me. "You're mistaken, Maya. You have something invaluable that they can't ever take away. Your intelligence, your skills. Remember who you are," he encouraged. He rose and walked over to his desk in the corner of the room, where he pulled out a checkbook and began writing. "I've been setting money aside for you. Not for a rainy day like this necessarily, but to help launch you when you were ready," he explained as he handed me the check. I glanced at the amount, $400,000, my eyes bulging in astonishment. "This is for you to kickstart your own IT company, just like you've always wanted," he stated, his voice resolute. I embraced him, my heart swelling with gratitude.
Thank you, Dad.
"I promise I won't let you down." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. I reached out to my former colleagues, many of whom were still unemployed after our company's fall. "Hey, it's Maya. I'm putting together something new, and I want you in. Are you interested?" Almost all of them responded with eager enthusiasm, grateful for the chance to get back to work. We secured a modest office space in the downtown area, and I invested part of the money to properly equip it. My friend Eloise, an online journalist, caught wind of what I was doing and was thrilled. "Maya, this is incredible.
Let me write about it.
People need to know who's spearheading the new tech movement in our city." Her article went live a week later, outlining my journey and the vision for my new venture. It quickly drew the attention of potential clients, and soon enough, we landed our first contracts. Hayden's call caught me off guard. His tone was icy, detached. "Come over tomorrow. The divorce papers are ready." I went to the familiar house the next morning, steeling myself for what awaited. Hayden opened the door, his greeting nothing more than a nod towards the living room where his smug-looking parents were seated. "There she is, the freeloader," Cora muttered audibly as I walked in. I ignored her and focused on Hayden, who thrust a stack of papers at me. "Sign here," he instructed, pointing indifferently to the signature line. His contempt was clear, but I wasn't there to reconcile. I signed my name, each stroke severing ties with the life I once feared losing. As I set down the pen, Tyler chuckled. "Well, that's one problem solved. Good riddance." Hayden's eyes were fixed on the papers, but Cora stared directly at me, her expression a blend of triumph and relief. "We're finally free of the burden. Hopefully, you can manage on your own without leeching off someone else," she said. I couldn't help but smile, feeling a surge of vindication, knowing what I was about to reveal. I swiftly pulled out my phone and tapped on the screen, then showed them the article, "Rising Star in Tech. Maya Tucker launches innovative IT firm." I watched their faces morph from confusion to shock. "Maya, how? Where did you get the money for this?" Hayden stuttered, his previous disdain giving way to disbelief. "My father," I said simply, locking eyes with him. "Tucker, the owner of the trading company you never bothered to inquire about because we lived too simply for your tastes." Hayden's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find words. Cora's face turned pale, her earlier smugness completely erased. "Why choose a modest home? Given your wealth," they questioned incredulously. I explained calmly, "My son, we've never pursued extravagance. We've always cherished other values, unlike some." Their stunned silence filled the room, marking the moment my sense of liberation grew stronger. As Hayden's parents fumbled through their apologies, trying to explain their earlier comments, I raised my hand to cut them off. "Please, save your excuses. Today, you've shown your true selves, and it's been quite enlightening." I interrupted, turning to leave, their feeble apologies trailing off behind me. Hayden chased after me, his face etched with desperation. "Maya, can we try again? None of this was meant to hurt you. Let's fix this," he pleaded. Facing him one last time, I replied firmly, "No, Hayden, we can't."
Goodbye.
That farewell marked the end I needed. As I drove off, my phone buzzed incessantly with texts, more pleas from Hayden and his parents. But I was resolved. I replied with a single, definitive word that felt like sealing the past behind me. No. Back in the tranquility of my new office, I took a deep breath. Starting afresh hadn't been simple, but as I surveyed the bustling office filled with my dedicated team, I felt confident in my decision. These were the people I chose to invest in, individuals who valued hard work and innovation, not those who measured relationships by their wealth. My name is Camila Smith, and I was raised in the bustling world of sports nutrition, where my parents, the founders of Smith Nutrition, taught me the ropes. Despite our family's wealth, my upbringing was anything but pampered. My father instilled in me the importance of diligence from a very young age. I vividly recall my first day at the office. I was just 8 years old, donned my favorite blue dress adorned with tiny flowers, trying to appear as professional as possible. "Camila," my father said as he set up a small desk for me near his, "one day, all of this could be yours, but you'll have to earn it, just like I did." These words profoundly shaped my upbringing. Unlike other kids who enjoyed their summers poolside, I was busy learning about inventory management and customer service. My mother occasionally fretted that I was missing out on a typical childhood, but I cherished every moment at the company. It became my second home. College sped by in a flurry of business courses and internships at my father's company, where I worked from the warehouse up, with no exceptions. The long-standing employees, who had known me since childhood, respected my dedication to learning the business from the ground up. Post-graduation, I immersed myself in the company, my days filled with back-to-back meetings, detailed reports, and strategic planning sessions. Romance was an alien concept. My college roommate, Malaya, often teased that I was wedded to my work. Everything shifted during our company's annual holiday party. I arrived late, having stayed back to finalize some quarterly reports. When I entered, the party was already buzzing. That's when I met Liam from our Oklahoma City branch. He was tall, with inviting brown eyes and a smile that washed away the weariness of a 15-hour workday. "You must be Camila," he greeted, offering a handshake. "I've heard a lot about you." We spent the evening discussing work, our families, and our aspirations. Liam seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. When he asked for my number, it felt like something clicked into place. Following that night, Liam and I kept in touch constantly, starting each day with his "good morning," beautiful texts, and ending them with long calls. Despite the distance, our connection deepened. One evening, after a particularly long video chat, I suggested, "Why don't you transfer to the main office? It would be great for your career, and we could be together." There was a pause before Liam gently declined, citing his close-knit family in Oklahoma City as his reason to stay. Disappointed yet understanding, I contemplated his counterproposal, relocating to Oklahoma City myself. After mulling it over for a day, I approached my father for advice. Explaining my situation and introducing him to the idea of Liam, I was surprised to see a smile spread across his face. "I was wondering when you'd ask," he remarked. "Liam has a solid reputation, and the Oklahoma City branch could indeed benefit from your leadership. If this is what you want, I'll make it happen." Moved by my father's support and excited about this new chapter, I realized that sometimes taking the path less traveled could lead to the most rewarding journeys. 3 weeks after my decision, I found myself in Liam's Oklahoma City apartment, navigating through a sea of moving boxes. "Welcome home," he greeted, his arms enveloping me warmly. Standing there, I felt truly at home, certain that I was right where I belonged. The opportunity to meet his family came quicker than I anticipated. They all lived under one roof in a modest 2-story house, his parents, Benjamin and Carla, his sister Willow, and her teenage son, Dylan. The nerves kicked in as we approached their home. Carla's first words as I entered were, "Your family must live in a mansion. This must seem so quaint to you." I could feel my cheeks redden with her remark. "Oh no, not at all," I hurried to explain. "We've always lived quite ordinarily, no mansions or private jets." "But with your family's wealth," Benjamin began. I cut in, "I've worked for everything since I was young. My dad instilled the value of earning your keep. Honestly, I'm more at ease with simpler things." I noticed the slight looks of disappointment they exchanged, but I chose to ignore them. Willow, eyeing my simple sweater and jeans, remarked snidely, "If I had your money, I wouldn't be caught dead in anything but designer labels." I just shrugged, unsure how to respond, while Liam, squeezing my hand under the table, remained silent. 3 months later, Liam proposed during a simple walk in the park. It was a modest affair, just the two of us, a plain ring, and a sincere proposal. I said yes, without hesitation. However, when it came to wedding planning, we faced our first major disagreement. Liam envisioned an opulent wedding, a large venue, hundreds of guests, the full works. Babe, we don't need all that, I argued. Let's have something small and meaningful. He reluctantly agreed, and we had a modest ceremony with just immediate family. Yet, during the reception, I overheard Carla whispering to her sister, I expected something much grander from someone of her background. All this, it's so plain. I pretended not to hear, but their words cut deeper than I admitted. The ink had barely dried on our marriage certificate when the questions about housing began. It was during a typical Sunday dinner at Benjamin and Carla's, Willow on her phone, Dylan playing video games, and Benjamin watching sports on TV. So, Camila, Carla started, casually passing the mashed potatoes, have you talked to your father about buying you two a house? I was just looking at listings there yesterday. A beautiful 6-bedroom with a pool. I nearly choked on my water. Actually, we're planning to save up and buy our place, I managed to say. The room fell silent. Willow paused, fork midair. Benjamin muted the TV and turned to look at me. Carla's face froze into that all-too-familiar artificial smile. They exchanged glances that seemed to convey I'd made a faux pas. But surely your father wouldn't mind, Benjamin started, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. It's just natural for parents to help their kids get started, especially when they can, I responded firmly, yet politely, sitting up straighter. Liam and I want to do this on our own. We're both working, and we plan to save. I believe in earning what you have. Liam reached for my hand under the table, his grip firm but his palms slightly sweaty. I support Camilo on this, he added, although his voice lacked conviction. Besides, my apartment is fine for now. I've been renting it for years. The tension in the room was palpable as Carla's eyes sparkled with what seemed like a sudden epiphany. Setting down her wine glass a bit too forcefully, she proposed, well, if you're staying in the apartment, Camila should cover the rent. After all, she earns quite a bit more than you, Liam. It's only fair. I watched, feeling a sting of discomfort as Liam quickly nodded in agreement. That makes sense, he said, avoiding eye contact. It's $6,000 a month. The amount caught me off guard. Oklahoma City was expensive, but $6,000 seemed steep for our area. Nonetheless, not wanting to stir up any more tension, I agreed lightly. Sure, that's fair. So, it was settled. Each month, I handed over $6,000 to Liam, who would then supposedly handle the rent. Occasionally, I noticed him making the transfer on his phone, swiftly shutting the screen if I approached. This arrangement continued for some time until one evening, a nagging thought interrupted my usual review of our monthly expenses. Over dinner, with the ambient noise of the city wafting through our open window, I ventured, since I'm paying the rent now, maybe we should put the lease in my name? It could be beneficial for tax purposes. Liam's reaction was oddly swift and tense. He nearly dropped his fork onto his half-eaten pasta, and his face lost color. No, that wouldn't work, he replied quickly, his voice unusually high. I've been renting for Mr. Ethan for years. He trusts me. We don't want to upset a good thing. His response unsettled me. The way he couldn't meet my eyes, the tremor in his hands as he reached for his water glass. Despite pushing these doubts aside, life in Oklahoma City had settled into a routine. I was acclimating to my role at the branch office, managing my team well, and maintaining regular video calls with my parents. Everything appeared perfect, except for a recurring issue that increasingly troubled me. It first happened on a Tuesday when I returned home early from work with a headache, only to find Carla and Willow lounging on my couch, watching my TV, and devouring the expensive salmon I had bought for Liam's birthday. Oh, Camila, Carla said nonchalantly, not bothering to rise. We were just having a little snack. I stood frozen, key in hand, as they sat with their shoes on my coffee table, magazines strewn about, and my kitchen in disarray. This intrusion soon became a regular annoyance. I would either come home to find them there or find traces of their visits, like empty food containers or my belongings displaced, my closet evidently rifled through. They had keys, of course. One evening, I attempted to address it with Liam. Honey, don't you think it's strange that your mom and sister just come over whenever they want? He barely glanced up from his phone, dismissive. They're family, Camila. You're being dramatic. Just calm down. But I couldn't just calm down, especially not when I caught them giggling over my college diary they had found in an unpacked box, invading my privacy. Resolutely, I confronted them. We need to talk. This isn't okay. You can't just come into our home uninvited, or rummage through our things. Instantly, Carla's demeanor changed as she burst into tears, playing the victim. How dare you? She cried as if I had wronged her. After everything we've done to welcome you into our family, I knew you were too good for us with your fancy background. As if on cue, Liam entered, witnessing the scene, his mother sobbing, Willow glaring, and me standing my ground, shaken but firm. Standing there in disbelief, I could hardly comprehend the scene unfolding before me. What have you done? He demanded, rushing to console his mother. She's trying to push us away. Carla sobbed into his shoulder, claiming we aren't welcome here anymore. Before I could explain, Liam interrupted. How could you treat them this way? They are my family. After they left, Liam confronted me, his expression more severe than ever. You need to make this right, he instructed sternly. Get them something nice, really nice, and apologize. The next day, I went shopping after work, picking out a designer handbag that Carla had been eyeing and a pair of high-end boots for Willow. I felt a pang of guilt as I wrapped them, questioning my motives. When I delivered the gifts, their acceptance was tinged with arrogance. We knew you'd come around, Carla remarked, barely glancing my way as she admired her new handbag. These will do, Willow chimed in, slipping into her boots. That evening, Liam finally spoke to me, his tone light. See, was that so hard, he said, kissing my cheek. But something felt off, a change I couldn't quite identify yet. Following the incident, things deteriorated further. Carla and Willow mastered the art of gift extortion. Every minor celebration turned into a demand. You know it's National Sister Day next week, Willow would hint, eyeing a luxury item. It's the anniversary of when I first held Liam as a baby, Carla declared another time. A spa weekend seems fitting to commemorate it. The demands became relentless, encompassing Mother's Day, birthdays, Christmas, and even Groundhog Day. When I hesitated over a pricey gift for Arbor Day, Carla broke down at a family dinner. Some people just don't value family loyalty, she cried, while Willow consoled her. Later, Liam confronted me. Why must you be so difficult? They're your family now, too. But when his mother demanded a luxury watch for National Ice Cream Day, I had to speak up. Liam, don't you see this as excessive? He merely shrugged. If you can afford it, why not help the family? As if the financial pressures weren't enough, Dylan, Willow's teenage son, began visiting more frequently. Initially, I tried to be patient, understanding the challenges of adolescence. However, Dylan's disrespect escalated quickly. One evening, after I spent hours preparing a special family recipe, Dylan dismissed the meal with a harsh, "This is garbage." When I denied him money for the movies, he stormed out, accusing me of being miserly on purpose. That night, I attempted to discuss Dylan's behavior with Liam. He was really out of line today. Could you maybe talk to him? I pleaded. Liam, distracted by his phone, replied indifferently, "You need to handle it yourself. Think of it as practice for when we have our kids." The next day, Dylan returned, brazenly demanding money for a new video game. The ongoing disrespect and manipulation were taking a toll, and I realized that something had to change, not just with the gifts, but within our family dynamics. As I declined his request, Dylan sprawled across our couch, cranked up the TV volume to its maximum, and began making snide remarks about fake humble rich people. I turned to my husband, seeking some form of support, but he just walked out of the room, leaving me to deal with his smirking nephew alone. At that moment, feeling isolated in my own home, the loneliness was overwhelming. It's startling how much can change, or how much you can convince yourself things will improve if you just keep trying, remain patient, and continue to give. I'm visiting Mom and Dad this weekend, I mentioned to Liam one morning during breakfast, hoping he might join. He barely looked up from his phone.
Can't.
Promised I'd help them with some things around the house. The drive to my parents' home was tranquil. Mom prepared my favorite lasagna, and Dad cracked his usual dad jokes. For a few precious hours, I felt like the old me, the Camila who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted from life. But peace can be fragile, shattered in an instant. When I returned to our apartment on Sunday evening, the first thing that hit me was the stench: stale beer, pizza, and something fouler. The living room was a disaster zone. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts in solo cups, towers of greasy pizza boxes. Dylan and a handful of teenagers were sprawled across the floor, evidence of a wild party. "Get up," I shouted, my voice trembling with anger. "All of you, out now." The teenagers scrambled to their feet, gathering their belongings, except Dylan, who stretched out lazily and gave me that all-too-familiar smirk. "Why should I leave? I live here now," he declared. My heart sank as he casually mentioned a fallout with his mother and grandmother. Decided this was better than their rules. "Uncle Liam said I could crash here. We rent this apartment, and we have problems," I managed, my voice steady despite my boiling frustration. "Give me your keys now." Dylan laughed, a laugh that pierced through the tension. "Rent this apartment? That's funny. This is Uncle Liam's place. Has been ever since great-grandpa left it to him," he said. My head spun as he continued. "It's always been his. Got it when great-grandpa died 7 years ago. Everyone knows that." I was speechless, gasping for air. 4 years of making rent payments. Every time I had suggested putting the lease in my name, every evasive maneuver he had made, every secretive glance at his phone during those transactions, it had all been a lie. Seeing my distress, Dylan's demeanor shifted from cockiness to something resembling sympathy. "Look," he said awkwardly, patting my shoulder, "there's something else you should know." He pulled out his phone, fumbling with it. "I've been recording some of their conversations. Started doing it when they were talking about me, but, well, they talk about you a lot too." Liam's laugh filled the room from the speaker. "It's perfect," he was saying, $6,000 a month straight into my pocket. She doesn't even question it. My heart sank as Dylan played more recordings, each one unveiling deeper layers of betrayal. As Willow's voice echoed from the recording, boasting about family loyalty and how easily I'd cave, the gravity of their deceit sunk deeper. She got a new designer bag from her last week. She gloated, sure of her manipulation. But it was Carla's voice that cut even sharper. "Just make sure you get her pregnant soon. Once there's a baby, her dad will definitely buy you a house." He wouldn't let his grandchild live in an apartment. The sting of betrayal intensified, yet the worst revelations were still unfolding. Dylan hesitated before playing another clip. Liam's voice, slightly slurred, filled the room. "She's such an idiot, can't even satisfy me in bed. Thank God for Chloe, Marilyn, and what's her name from accounting." Carla's caution followed, her tone casual yet calculating. "Just be careful, honey. Don't let Camila catch you. At least not until we've squeezed every penny we can out of her." The phone nearly slipped through my numb fingers, but Dylan caught it. Could you send those to me?" My voice cracked under the weight of my heartbreak. He nodded and quickly transferred the recordings. As I received the notification, Dylan gathered his belongings. At the door, he paused, turning back with a somber look. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "They're all snakes, you know. Always have been. Even Mom. I guess that's why they dislike me so much. I can't pretend like they do." With a soft click, the door shut behind him, leaving me alone in the trashed apartment, a stark metaphor for my marriage. A beautiful facade hiding nothing but rot underneath. Without bothering to clean up, I got into my car and drove straight to Carla and Benjamin's house, where I knew they would be having their Sunday family dinner. They were all there, gathered around the dining table in a scene that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting, a false depiction of family unity. As I walked in, Carla's fake smile widened. "Camila, we weren't expecting you. How was your visit with your parents?" Ignoring her, I fixed my gaze on Liam. "Show me the rental agreement for our apartment," I demanded. The room fell silent, Liam's fork freezing midair. "What rental agreement?" he faltered. "The lease." "Show it to me," I insisted. He recovered quickly, flashing that charming smile that once melted my heart. "Oh, honey, Mr. Ethan doesn't do formal contracts. We've known each other for years." "Mr. Ethan doesn't exist," I interrupted sharply. "The apartment belongs to you. It always has." Carla quickly tried to deflect, her voice unnaturally high. "Camila, dear, would you like some pot roast? I tried that recipe you mentioned." "Shut up, Carla," I snapped, my voice icy, silencing the room. I had never spoken to them like that before. Turning back to Liam, I pressed on. "What have you been doing with my $6,000 every month for the last 3 years?" He chuckled nervously, sweat beginning to show on his forehead. "Come on, Camila. It's not a big deal. So, I own the apartment. What difference does it make? We're married." "What difference?" I echoed, pulling out my phone. As I played the recordings, Liam's voice filled the room, boasting about the money he pocketed from me without a second thought. The recordings played on, unveiling their schemes and mockery, their plans for exploiting my trust to secure more money from my family. The color drained from their faces, their own words condemning them. As the last echoes of the recordings faded, the room was enveloped in a silence so deep, you could have heard a pin drop. Liam had turned ghost white, Willow seemed on the verge of sickness, and Carla's meticulously applied makeup did little to mask her sheer terror. "I'm divorcing you, Liam," I declared, my voice unwavering. "Expect the papers this week. And if you try to contact me about anything other than the divorce proceedings, I'll make these recordings public." I'm sure the business community would be intrigued to learn how you scammed your wife out of $216,000. Without waiting for their response, I turned and walked out, their feeble protests fading into the background. I drove back to what was technically his apartment and packed my belongings with methodical precision. By sunset, my car was packed, and I was on my way to my parents' house. My parents were still awake when I arrived. One look at my face told them all they needed to know. Something was profoundly wrong. I shared everything with them, playing the damning recordings. My father's expression darkened with each passing moment. "I'll handle this," he assured me after I finished. True to his word, by the next day, Liam had been fired, and my father ensured that his reputation in the business world was left in ruins. The divorce proceedings were swift. Liam initially tried to contest them, but the evidence in the recordings was irrefutable, especially the parts detailing the financial deceit. The judge showed particular interest in the fraudulent transactions. Liam ended up with nothing but his apartment and a tarnished name. For months later, I found myself back at headquarters, immersing myself in work and beginning the slow process of rebuilding my life. It was then that I received a text from Dylan. We agreed to meet for coffee. He appeared changed, more mature, less hostile. "I got a job at the car wash," he shared, "moved out of Mom's place after they discovered I was the one who gave you the recordings. It was the best decision I ever made. I could help you," I offered, "get you a position at the company." He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Thanks, but I need to do this on my own. Clean slate, you know? Besides, I'm saving up for community college." I understood perfectly. Sometimes, the only way forward is to leave everything behind and start anew, building something authentic from scratch. That night, in my new apartment, my real rental, with a legitimate lease in my name, I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the one who had fallen for Liam's charms 3 years ago. She was stronger, wiser, and genuinely free at last. I picked up my phone and began deleting their numbers one by one. As the last light of day glinted off the diamond on my ring finger, my grandmother's ring, not the one Liam had given me, it shattered into 1,000 points of light. Outside, the city buzzed with the energy of the evening, ripe with possibilities and new beginnings. I was ready to embrace mine. After I returned from an exhausting outdoor sketching session, I was completely drained by the time I reached home. My recent days had been increasingly tough, with both mental and physical exhaustion piling up. An accidental overhearing of a conversation between my parents added a heavy blow. Maybe we should have Emily earn an extra $5,000 each month, my father suggested, seemingly concerned. I'm worried. She might just collapse from overworking, he added. To which my mother coldly laughed. It's okay if she collapses. She's not related to us by blood, after all. Shocked, I silently withdrew to my room, my presence unnoticed. That moment marked a profound revelation for me. I was not their biological child. This new understanding explained the distant coldness they had always shown towards me. Anger bubbled inside me as I realized they had been manipulating me, offering sporadic affection only as bait while exploiting my hard work. I resolved then and there that I would no longer forgive their deceit. I won't forgive them anymore, I affirmed to myself, my determination hardening. They had their plans and I would have mine. That very night, I left the family home, determined to shed all the imposed notions of love and familial duty that had been thrust upon me. My name is Emily, and at 28 years old, I hold a clear perspective on the role of parents in their child's happiness. While I once read an article claiming a child's happiness is heavily influenced by their parents, my experience taught me otherwise. My early years were marked by unhappiness, despite growing up in what appeared to be a nurturing environment. Our family dynamics shifted drastically when I started elementary school. My father won a significant amount in the lottery, and the sudden wealth transformed my parents. The gentle, caring people they once were turned into strangers under the influence of their new fortune. Look, $300,000. I won, my father had exclaimed. I can't believe it. There are so many things I want, my mother had chimed in, excited by the prospects. They soon quit their jobs and began squandering the money, leaving me with sitters and disappearing on whimsical trips, indulging in luxuries without a second thought for their daughter. Why am I always left behind? I wondered initially, but over time, deeper concerns about their erratic behavior grew. It was starkly different from other families where parents maintained steady jobs. This lifestyle persisted until they had blown through the lottery winnings, sinking into a routine of morning-to-night drinking, neglecting both home and child. The house fell into disarray, a stark contrast to our past life. My parents, once affectionate and responsible, had become unrecognizable, engulfed by their hedonistic lifestyle. As our financial situation worsened, we could no longer afford a house cleaning service. Our home, cluttered and overflowing with garbage, began to reek of neglect. Amidst this chaos, my often inebriated parents would shout at me, "Stop daydreaming and clean up. You can do the cleaning, can't you? Do you even have a purpose for being here?" Their words made me question my very existence, a question that haunted me since childhood. While doing chores, I often wondered why I was in such a situation. I wondered if other children lived like this. Eventually, our food supply dwindled to nothing. With no one working and no income, even selling household items wasn't an option anymore. My parents, oblivious to my embarrassment, would push me outside, saying, "Emily, come outside today. Don't worry about it. No one is looking at you." Encouraged by them, I would roam the downtown streets at night, scavenging for edible scraps like a stray dog, often chased away or scolded by store owners. Miraculously, I avoided police intervention. When I returned home with a bag of leftovers, my hungry parents would eagerly wait. "You're late. What took you so long? Hurry up and give it here," they'd demand. As I watched them devour the food, tears streamed down my face. The next day at school, while I looked forward to the school lunch, the other kids would make faces of disgust due to the smell of leftovers on my clothes. Their cold stares were hard to bear. One evening, as I was out again searching for food, a woman approached me. A neighbor had noticed our dire situation and contacted her. "I'm Violet, a social worker. Are your parents home? I need to speak with them," she said. That was the moment everything began to change. Violet talked with my parents, and gradually, our lives improved. My father got a job through vocational training, and my mother started working part-time again. With a stable income and welfare support, We could afford proper meals and new clothes. Violet became a beacon of hope for me. I'm often at the city office, so contact me anytime you need help, she offered. Despite these improvements, my mother continued to struggle with alcohol, her repeated mistakes and tardiness at work eventually leading her to quit. She spent her days in front of the TV, doing nothing. Managing the household became my responsibility. I would go to the supermarket with the money my father gave me, buying instant food and bread. "Why are you even here?" my father would grumble. That question, "Why am I here?" persisted even as I grew older. Despite initially happy childhood days, my father's gambling problems began consuming any extra money, leading to debts that threatened to return us to days of desperation. During middle school, I took a part-time job delivering newspapers in the morning. The income allowed me to buy new stationery and shoes. During this time, I faced another challenge. I had never been taught about wearing a bra. After a humiliating comment from a classmate, I remained stooped and embarrassed. I called Violet, who accompanied me to buy a new bra. "Why are my parents so indifferent? They don't care about me," I lamented to Violet. "Parents are different, Emily, but don't worry. You're doing great," she reassured me, her support a constant in my life as I navigated the challenges of growing up amidst neglect. Violet has always been a dependable friend. When I needed support, she welcomed me into her home, teaching me to cook and sharing valuable life lessons. Her kindness made me question the coldness of my parents, who never showed much warmth. Throughout high school, while I barely got by, Violet cared for me as if I were her own. When it came time to decide my future, my parents finally took an interest. They opposed my idea of moving out after graduation, pleading with me to stay, claiming it was out of love. So I stayed. Drawing became my escape. I spent hours sketching at home, eventually selling my artwork online after a colleague's suggestion. Surprisingly, my art sold well, and I could make as much as my monthly salary. My parents, seeing the success, encouraged me to keep drawing, thrilled at my growing popularity. With their support, I updated my supplies and expanded my reach through social media, even landing a gig with a major fast food chain. For the first time, I felt valued by them. Encouraged by my parents, I quit my day job at 23 to pursue art full-time. Freelancing requires discipline and resilience, especially to meet tight deadlines. My parents' initial encouragement turned into pressure, and their praises faded as they grew accustomed to the steady income. They became demanding, pushing me even when I was ill. Over time, the joy I found in art turned to resentment. I continued to work hard, fueled by fleeting moments of motivation from their rare praises. Then one day, exhausted from sketching outdoors, I overheard them joking about pushing me harder, revealing I was not their biological child. This shocking discovery left me reeling, questioning everything about our relationship. Growing up, I always sensed a chill in the air between my parents and me, a divide I couldn't quite bridge. It was hard to accept, but deep down, I felt it stemmed from the fact that we weren't related by blood. This realization brought a mix of frustration and anger that was hard to articulate. Often, while I painted, my hands would tremble with a mixture of emotion and efforts that seemed invisible to them. One day, I finally admitted to myself, I can't forgive them anymore. That was the turning point for me. I decided then to let go of the burdens of imposed love and familial obligations. I began making plans for a future that was entirely my own. The very next day, under the guise of calm, I left the house and checked into a hotel. During my stay, I noticed several missed calls from my mother, signaling a confrontation I could no longer avoid. When I picked up the phone, my mother's voice was fraught with emotion and anxiety. "Emily, where are you? Why are you staying out without permission? Are you with someone? Why didn't you contact us?" Her questions bombarded me. In response, I told her about my visit to the city office to obtain a copy of the family register. My words left her speechless, unsure of how to continue. I confronted her about my adoption, which I had discovered after finding some revealing documents while my parents were passed out drunk. "Is it true that I was adopted?" I asked. Her admission came hesitantly. "Yes, it's true. I'm sorry we never told you. The shop incident wasn't the sole reason for my leaving. It was a culmination of years of feeling marginalized and exploited. I made it clear to her, "Tell Dad I won't be coming back." Despite her agitation and attempts to understand, I stood firm. Eventually, we agreed to meet at a cafe to discuss things further. It was a quiet spot, usually not too crowded. As I arrived, my parents were already there, their faces etched with a mix of anger and worry. "Why did you leave on your own?" Your mother and I were really worried. My father expressed his concern and disbelief. "Did you really mean to leave?"
Why decide this way?
"You could have stayed with us," my mother added. But I was resolute. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. From now on, I will paint only for myself." I reaffirmed my decision. Their response was to chastise me for my irresponsibility. But my anger mirrored theirs, fueled by years of feeling used. "Because I heard you two planning to make me earn an additional $5,000, I revealed what I had overheard during one of their drunken conversations. This caught them off guard. They stumbled over their explanations, unable to justify their actions. I confronted them further about my adoption, revealing everything I had learned about my real parents and the convenience of my adoption to erase a significant debt. "It's true we took you in, but we do love you like our own daughter," my father tried to assure me. "Don't lie. You only see value in me for labor, right?" "I am no longer the one to be deceived," I countered, refusing to let the narrative continue. Our conversation at the cafe was not just a confrontation, but also a moment of truth where I shared my deepest feelings and disappointments. My mother's drinking, a constant source of embarrassment and pain in my life, was also laid bare. It was a tough, emotional exchange, but necessary for me to forge a path forward, free from the shadows of unspoken truths and conditional affections. My journey as an independent artist was just beginning, painted not for them, but for myself. She struggled to maintain control, and I always hoped she would pull herself together. It pained me to see her transform when she drank. Violet, the social worker, shared my concerns. Yes, the very same Violet who frequented our home to check on us. I still keep in touch with her, and my gratitude knows no bounds. Without her intervention, I shudder to think where I might be today, perhaps still scavenging leftovers during my school years or resorting to dubious means to make ends meet. The apartment I currently live in was secured through Violet's assistance, a safeguard she arranged to ensure I could find safety quickly if problems arose. Does the alcohol taste better when it's purchased with the money your daughter earned? You seem to relish it daily, neglecting household chores and merely tidying up on weekends. While it's true you've faced numerous challenges since your youth, including health issues, does that justify a reckless lifestyle now? That's mere indulgence. I don't recall many moments when you acted like a mother. Household responsibilities always fell to me, especially cleaning up after your episodes. And yet, you seem to think such a self-centered lifestyle is acceptable. Please, let's keep any jokes to a minimum. You don't realize the extent of my struggles. As I confronted her with a stern gaze, my mother appeared unsettled. "Stop. Don't be so harsh on your mom," they said. But the blame wasn't hers alone. Dad shared it too. "What do you mean?" My father growled, but I stood firm, unafraid and assertive. Now an adult, I could express myself clearly and highlight my father's shortcomings. "Your gambling has always been a problem," I continued. "Do you think I haven't noticed?" His response was a silent, guilty look. Poker, slots, horse racing, baccarat. He was still deeply mired in his gambling habits, often using the money I earned. I find this absolutely unacceptable. When they once won the lottery, they lived extravagantly, and $300,000 vanished in a few short years. "I was trying to increase that money," Dad claimed, but it was a poor excuse. His idea of investing was pouring it all into gambling, not a legitimate business venture. Laughing off his feeble justifications, I retorted, "That's not investing, that's gambling." "Please, stop twisting the words." Accusations of arrogance followed, questioning how I could speak so to my parents. "Can we drop the pretense of gratitude?" I challenged. I've never felt thankful to be raised by parents who thought it acceptable to send their child out in the middle of the night to rummage through garbage bins. You are far worse than any trash can. The conversation turned to his debts, still a massive burden. One should consider who really needs to be more reserved, I concluded, my voice a mix of resolve and fatigue. I've been funding my father's debts with my earnings. Despite this, he still carried an air of arrogance, as if he had the right. The respect I once held for him had vanished long ago. There was no need for him to act like a father now. His forceful demeanor only pushed me to a breaking point, prompting me to make a decisive move against him. I grabbed my smartphone and made a call. Soon enough, he was there. Mr. Andrew is a man well-versed in dealing with problematic situations like my father's. As my father recognized him, his face drained of color. "Mr. Andrew, why are you here?" he stammered. "Your daughter contacted me," Mr. Andrew replied calmly. "She mentioned there's something to discuss regarding your debts." I had done my homework, investigating my father's financial entanglements and discovering his connections, including a long-standing indebtedness to Mr. Andrew. I also uncovered that Mr. Andrew had facilitated my parents' meeting years ago. Mr. Andrew, who played a significant role in a shady, mafia-like organization, had occasionally forgiven portions of my father's debts while keeping him under close watch. "I was surprised to hear from your daughter, Bennett," Mr. Andrew continued. "You're using her earnings for repayments? That's hard to believe." "No, that's not true," my father protested weakly, but the truth was glaringly obvious. He had no income of his own and had squandered his lottery winnings, continuing to gamble and live beyond his means with the help of Mr. Andrew. "You might have used up all your luck when you won that lottery," I interjected. "And now, you're paying off your debts with my money, a truly pitiful way to live." Mr. Andrew shook his head. "Using your daughter's earnings for repayment is despicable. Shame on you," he chided. "I'm sorry," my father muttered, looking down. "You're apologizing to the wrong person," Mr. Andrew pointed out sternly. "Apologize to your daughter first. That's where you need to start. Acknowledge the trouble you've caused her and commit to settling your own debts from now on." Caught off guard, my father and mother could only nod, completely overwhelmed by Mr. Andrew's authoritative presence. As my father was lectured on parental responsibilities and began to tear up, I knew this would ensure he no longer misused my funds. It was now my mother's turn to face the music. I had previously arranged for Violet, the social worker who had been a beacon of support, to follow Mr. Andrew. Violet entered with her usual calm and commanding presence. "I came here today at Emily's request," she announced to my parents. "Did you really say it doesn't matter if she collapses from overwork because she's not your real child? Please tell me the truth." My parents stumbled over their words, their guilty expressions revealing the truth. Violet sighed deeply, her disappointment palpable. "It's truly unforgivable," she said. "You need to start by formally apologizing to Emily." Although she spoke softly, Violet's authority filled the room, leaving my parents looking like chastened children. "I'm sorry, Emily," they finally said. "We'll try not to cause you any more trouble." "That would be appreciated," I responded, feeling a weight lifting off my shoulders. "I will be moving out, and from now on, I will not provide any financial support. Is that understood?" Reluctantly, my parents nodded. Violet gave me a kind smile, signaling a new chapter of independence and freedom from the financial exploitation by the people who were supposed to protect me. Together, Violet and I left the establishment, leaving my parents to reflect on their actions. They later found jobs, and I heard they were managing to cover their living expenses and debts with their earnings, finally taking responsibility for their lives. About a year after I moved out, my parents' financial situation took a nosedive again. I got the details during a phone call from Mr. Andrew. It turned out that Bennett, my father, had been persuaded by a gambling buddy to take on more debt, and now he was scrambling to find help to manage the repayments. Mr. Andrew warned me that my father might try to reach out to me for assistance. "Be careful," Mr. Andrew advised. "He might even contact you." Sure enough, a few days later, my parents called. "Emily, I'm sorry to contact you like this. Did you hear about the debt?" "I heard from Mr. Andrew," my father began. "To be clear, I won't lend you any more money." I cut in before he could continue. Please help me. I have no one else to turn to but you, Emily. This is the last time, he pleaded. Why should I believe you? I asked, tired of the same old story. Their attempts to use me were clear, and I firmly refused their request, ending the conversation on bad terms. I had no regrets about it. If severing ties meant freedom from their endless problems, then nothing could be better. Later, Mr. Andrew informed me that my parents had moved north. They sold everything they could, abandoned their house, and left the urban area. He updated me with a laugh. No matter where they hide, it's useless. They really are pitiable people. If they contact you, let me know right away. I'll handle it before any trouble comes your way. That helps a lot, thank you. I'll definitely contact you if anything happens, I replied, relieved to have his support. Since then, I haven't been in touch with Mr. Andrew, nor have I heard from my parents. Thankfully, no new problems have arisen. I hope for continued peace and to avoid any further dealings with my troubled parents or the loan industry. In the midst of all this, Violet, the social worker who had always been there for me, introduced me to a very charming man. He was a distant relative of hers, around my age, and ran his own business. After I showed him some of my artwork, he was impressed and wanted to display one of my pieces in his office. We were making arrangements for that and even planning a date at an art museum. I went to Violet to talk about the new developments. It's great that things are working out between you two. I'm glad I introduced him. Let me know if there are any new developments, she said with a smile.
Thank you, Violet.
I'm always grateful for your support. I don't even know how to properly thank you, I replied. Don't worry about it, I love helping. It makes me happy to see you smile, Emily, Violet responded. Reflecting on the days of struggling with troublesome parents, searching for leftovers, and living in a cluttered house, I felt grateful for the present. Surrounded by trustworthy people and having met someone special, I acknowledged that life, despite its hardships, was worthwhile. Believing in this, I intended to continue living positively, valuing my individuality, and embracing the new opportunities ahead.
I never expected to become my grandmother's caretaker at 28. I had a promising career as an environmental engineer in Chicago, a small but trendy apartment, and a life that was finally finding its rhythm after years of hard work. But when Grandma Ellie called to tell me she'd fallen and broken her hip, everything changed. It's nothing serious, Sam, she'd insisted over the phone, her voice weak despite her efforts to sound strong. The doctor says I'll be fine after some rest. But I knew better. At 84, a broken hip was serious, and Grandma Ellie lived alone on the old family farm in rural Oklahoma, 20 miles from the nearest hospital and far from any relatives. The 100-acre farm had been in our family for 3 generations, though the actual farming had stopped years ago when Grandpa died. Now it was just Grandma in that big old farmhouse, surrounded by empty fields and memories. I took a leave of absence from my job and flew home the next day. The plan was to stay for 2 weeks, help Grandma get set up with in-home care, and return to my life. 2 weeks turned into a month turned into 3, and gradually I realized I couldn't leave her. You're throwing your life away, my mother declared during one of her rare visits. Mom had moved to Phoenix years ago, preferring desert heat to Oklahoma dust. Ellie needs to be in a nursing home. You need to be building your career. I'm not throwing anything away, I replied, setting a cup of tea in front of her. I'm working remotely, and Grandma's getting better every day. Mom snorted. On that engineer's salary, taking care of an old woman and a money pit of a farm. Be realistic, Samantha. That was my mother, always practical, always focused on financial security. She'd grown up on this farm and couldn't wait to escape it. In her eyes, my decision to stay was incomprehensible. My Uncle Peter was even worse. He called monthly from his vacation home in Florida, ostensibly to check on Grandma, but really to suggest listing the farm for sale. That property's worth good money, Sam, he'd say, as if I didn't know. Not the house. That's falling apart. But the land. Developers would snatch it up. Ellie could live comfortably in a nice facility, And there'd be plenty left over. By plenty left over, he meant his inheritance. Uncle Peter had never hidden his expectation that, as Grandma's only son, he deserved the lion's share of whatever she left behind. Then there were my cousins, Jessica and Mark, who visited on holidays with expensive gifts and loud voices, filling a quiet farmhouse with forced cheer before disappearing back to their busy lives. They never stayed long enough to help with Grandma's physical therapy or medication management. They certainly never emptied a bedpan or helped her bathe when she was too weak to do it herself. "You're a saint, Sam," Jessica would say, air kissing my cheek on her way out. "I don't know how you do it. Don't you get bored out here with nothing happening?" But there was plenty happening, just not the kind of excitement Jessica would recognize. There was Grandma regaining her ability to walk unassisted. There was the victory of her first trip up the stairs without pain. There was the garden we planted together, Grandma directing from her chair while I dug in the rich Oklahoma soil. And there were the stories. In the quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the empty fields, Grandma Ellie told me about her life. Stories I'd never heard before. About how she'd met Grandpa at a dance during World War II. About the early years on the farm when drought nearly ruined them. About the oil companies that had approached them decades ago, offering to buy mineral rights, and how Grandpa had steadfastly refused. "Edgar always said this land was our legacy, not something to be exploited," she explained, her weathered hands smoothing the quilt across her lap. "He wanted to pass it down intact, the way his father passed it to him." What she didn't tell me, what none of us knew, was that Grandpa hadn't simply refused those oil companies. He'd made a different kind of deal altogether. I found out a year later when Grandma Ellie passed away peacefully in her sleep. I'd been with her until the end, holding her hand as she drifted off, whispering that she was loved. The pain of losing her was sharp and deep, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. The funeral was held in the small church where Grandma had attended services for over 60 years. The pews were filled with neighbors and friends, people whose lives she touched with her quiet kindness. My family was there too, of course. Mom flying in from Phoenix, Uncle Peter from Florida, cousins Jessica and Mark from their respective cities. "You look exhausted," Mom commented, eyeing me critically. "When was the last time you had a proper haircut?" I ignored the question, too tired for her particular brand of concern. I'd spent the last year caring for Grandma, watching her good days slowly become fewer than her bad ones. A haircut hadn't been a priority. After the service, everyone gathered at the farmhouse. It was the first time in years that the old place was full of people, the rooms echoing with voices instead of silence. I moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting condolences and trying to be a good host despite my grief. "Have you thought about what you'll do now?" Uncle Peter cornered me in the kitchen as I was refilling the coffee pot. "With Ellie gone, there's no reason for you to stay here." "I haven't decided," I said truthfully. My job in Chicago had long since been filled by someone else. The farm was the closest thing I had to a home now. "Well, don't make any hasty decisions," he advised, lowering his voice. "I've been talking to a developer who's very interested in this property. Once the will is settled, we could all do very well." I just nodded, too emotionally drained to argue. Let him have his plans. The truth was, I had no idea what Grandma's will contained. She'd updated it 6 months ago with her lawyer but hadn't shared the details with any of us. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at Mr. Harrington's law office in town. It was a small plain room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines in the waiting area. We all gathered there, Mom, Uncle Peter, Jessica, Mark, and me, an awkward family reunion under fluorescent lights. Mr. Harrington was in his 70s, a contemporary of Grandma's who'd handled the family's legal matters for decades. He adjusted his glasses and began reading the formal legal language, while Uncle Peter leaned forward eagerly in his chair. "To my son, Peter," Mr. Harrington read, "I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of antique fishing gear that belonged to his father." Uncle Peter's face fell. $50,000 was a substantial amount, but nowhere near the value of the farm he'd been counting on. "To my daughter, Linda," the lawyer continued, nodding toward my mother, "I leave $50,000 and my jewelry collection, including the pearl necklace she always admired." Mom nodded stiffly, her expression unreadable. "To my grandchildren, Jessica and Mark, I leave $25,000 each with the hope that they will use it wisely." Jessica and Mark exchanged glances. Like their father, they'd expected more. And to my granddaughter, Samantha, Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses again, who stayed by my side when I needed her most. I leave the farmhouse and all 100 acres of the surrounding land, along with any assets or rights pertaining to that property. The room went silent. Then Uncle Peter let out a sharp laugh. The farmhouse? That's falling apart. And those fields haven't produced a crop in years. The land alone must be worth something, Mom interjected, giving me a calculating look. Especially if that developer is still interested. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. There is a personal letter for Samantha as well, he said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma's shaky handwriting. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of paperwork and thinly veiled disappointment from my family. Uncle Peter was already on his phone as we left the office, presumably calling his developer contact to see if the deal could still be salvaged through me. Don't make any decisions without consulting us, he instructed as we stood in the parking lot. That property represents a family legacy. A family legacy he'd been eager to sell to the highest bidder just minutes before, I noted silently. You should at least hear what offers are out there, Mom added. That old house needs more work than it's worth. Be practical, Samantha. I promised to think about it, mostly to end the conversation. All I wanted was to go back to the farm, my farm now, and read Grandma's letter in private. Once home, I sat on the porch swing where Grandma and I had spent so many evenings and carefully opened the envelope. My dearest Sam, if you're reading this, I've moved on to be with your grandfather, and the farm is now yours. I want you to know this was always the plan, even before you came to help me after my fall. Your grandfather and I saw something in you from the time you were small, a love for this land that none of our other children or grandchildren shared. What you don't know, what none of the family knows, is that Edgar didn't simply refuse the oil companies all those years ago. He was shrewder than that. He sold mineral rights to a small portion of the property, just 10 acres on the far north corner, but retained the rights to the rest, believing that someday those rights would be far more valuable. He was right. 6 months ago, Mr. Harrington helped me negotiate a deal with Meridian Energy. They've confirmed significant oil deposits on our land, Sam. The contract is in the safe behind your grandfather's portrait in the study. The combination is our wedding date, 06 to 12/39. The first wells will be installed within a year of my passing. The income will be substantial, enough to restore the farmhouse, enough to live comfortably, enough to do whatever you dream of doing while keeping our land intact. This is your legacy now, not just the money, but the responsibility of stewardship. This land has been in our family for generations, and now I'm trusting it to you. I've seen how you care for things, Sam, how you tended to me, how you nurtured the garden, how you repaired the old porch swing without being asked. You have your grandfather's hands and heart. The others see the farm as a burden or a cash cow. You see it as a home. I love you, my sweet girl. Thank you for the gift of your time and care in my final years. I hope this gift I leave to you brings you as much joy as you brought to me. All my love, Grandma Ellie. I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face, before going to the study. The safe behind Grandpa's portrait contained exactly what Grandma had described, a thick contract with Meridian Energy, along with geological surveys showing significant oil deposits across the property. The projected income was staggering. Millions over the life of the wells. I sat up all night, thinking about what this meant, about what Grandma had entrusted to me, about how to honor both the financial opportunity and the family legacy she described. By morning, I had a plan. For the next 6 months, I said nothing to my family about the oil rights. When Uncle Peter called with news of a developer willing to pay top dollar for the land, I politely declined. When Mom suggested selling at least part of the property to fund a real life back in the city, I changed the subject. That farmhouse is eating up all your savings, she warned during one phone call. You're as stubborn as Ellie was. Thank you, I replied, taking it as the compliment it wasn't intended to be. Meanwhile, Meridian Energy began the process of installing the first wells on my property. I worked closely with their environmental teams to ensure minimal disruption to the land. I used some of the initial payments to begin restoring the farmhouse, hiring local contractors to repair the roof and replace the ancient plumbing. When the first well was completed and ready to begin production, I decided it was time. I sent identical invitations to Mom, Uncle Peter, Jessica, and Mark. You were cordially invited to a gathering at the family farm to celebrate new beginnings. Saturday, June 12th, 2 p.m. They all accepted, probably curious about what I could possibly be celebrating in that money pit of a farm. The day of the gathering was perfect. Clear blue Oklahoma sky, gentle breeze, the fields around the farmhouse lush and green. I'd had the house painted, the porch rebuilt, the garden landscaped. It looked better than it had in decades. Uncle Peter arrived first, his luxury SUV kicking up dust on the long driveway. He stepped out and looked around with obvious surprise. "Place looks different," he commented, taking in the improvements. "You've been busy." "I have," I agreed, leading him to the back porch where I'd set up refreshments. Mom, Jessica, and Mark arrived soon after, all making similar observations about the farm's transformation. "This must have cost a fortune," Mom said suspiciously. "Where did you get the money, Samantha?" "That's actually why I asked you all here today," I replied, handing each of them a glass of Grandma's favorite lemonade. "I wanted to show you something." I led them across the backfield, following a newly graveled path toward the north corner of the property. As we crested a small hill, the oil well came into view, a pumping unit moving rhythmically up and down against the horizon. They all stopped in their tracks. "Is that?" Uncle Peter began, his voice faltering. "An oil well." "Yes," I confirmed. "The first of several Meridian Energy will be installing over the next year." "There's oil on this property?" Mark asked incredulously. "Quite a lot, according to the surveys." I handed each of them a copy of a simplified version of the contract. Grandpa suspected it decades ago. He sold mineral rights to a small section but kept the rest. Grandma finalized this deal 6 months before she died. They stared at the papers, then at the well, then at me, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. "All this time," Uncle Peter said slowly, "when we thought this land was worthless." "It was never worthless," I corrected him. "It was always valuable, as our family home, as our heritage, as the place Grandma and Grandpa built their lives. The oil is just a bonus." "How much?" Jessica asked bluntly, scanning the contract. "How much is this worth?" "The projections are in the contract," I replied. "But it's substantial." Mom looked up from the papers, her face pale. "And Ellie left all of this to you?" "Just you?" "She left me the farm and everything pertaining to it," I confirmed, "including the mineral rights." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed the implications. The worthless farm they'd urged me to sell was now revealed as an asset worth millions. The year I'd wasted caring for Grandma had resulted in an inheritance beyond any of their expectations. "Well," Uncle Peter finally said, forcing a smile, "I suppose congratulations are in order. You certainly lucked out, Sam." "It wasn't luck," I said firmly. "Grandma made a choice, just like I'm making one now." I handed each of them a second document, a legal agreement establishing the Ellie and Edgar Williams Foundation. 50% of the oil revenues will go into this foundation, I explained. Its mission is to support sustainable agriculture, environmental conservation, and elder care in this county. I'm establishing it in Grandma and Grandpa's names. "And the other 50%? Mom asked. "Is mine," I said simply, "to maintain this farm, to live my life, and to ensure this land stays in the family for the next generation, just as Grandma and Grandpa wanted." "You could sell it all now and be set for life," Mark pointed out. "Why hang on to this place?" I looked around at the rolling fields, the old farmhouse in the distance, the big oak tree where Grandpa had built a swing decades ago. "Because some things are worth more than money," I said. "Grandma always told me that true wealth isn't what you have, but who you are." I believe that. My family stayed for another hour, asking questions about the oil deal, the foundation, my plans for the farm. The conversations were strained, undercurrents of regret and resentment flowing beneath their congratulatory words. But I didn't mind. I hadn't invited them to gloat or to make them feel guilty. I'd invited them because despite everything they were still family, and because I wanted them to understand what Grandma had tried to teach us all, that care and presence matter more than material success. That legacy isn't just about money, and that sometimes the things that appear least valuable hold the greatest worth. After they left, I sat on the newly rebuilt porch swing as the sun began to set. In the distance, the oil well continued its steady rhythm, pulling hidden treasure from deep within the land. But the real treasure, I knew, was the lesson Grandma had left me: to see value where others see nothing, to care for what matters, and to understand that the richest legacies aren't always visible to the casual observer. I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the swing, feeling closer to Grandma than I had since her passing. "I understand now," I whispered to the evening air. "Thank you." And somewhere, I like to think, Grandma Ellie was smiling.